Welcome. Before we begin tonight's story, I have one question. Where are you listening from tonight? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoy falling asleep to these calm but chilling tales, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. Now, close your eyes and let the forest take you. In the Hoh Rain Forest, it rains continuously for days on end. If you start working here, this will be the first thing you notice. The rain here doesn't fall as heavily as it does elsewhere. You won't see violent storms that subside after an hour, or sudden downpours that start without warning. Here, the rain is constant and persistent, as if the forest itself were breathing moisture to feed the rain. Everything is always wet, and you accept this as you would accept any other law of nature. My name is Ian Hollowell, and I've been working as a park ranger in Olympic National Park for 7 years. 7 years of wet clothes, misty landscapes, and trails that seem to shift beneath your feet. People think park rangers are concerned with wildlife and safely returning lost visitors to their vehicles. Of course, that's a big part of the job, but sometimes things change suddenly in some remote corner of the park. That's when you realize the forest doesn't care about your plans. Being prepared or experienced for potential emergencies doesn't change the outcome. The forest is there, and it offers you only 2 alternatives: respect it or fail. I was on morning patrol the day I found Grace Vickers' backpack. It was early, around 6:30, and the forest was still half asleep, wrapped in that pre-dawn hush where even the birds seem reluctant to make noise. I'd started my shift an hour earlier, checking the trailheads and making sure no one had camped where they weren't supposed to. It's a routine I've done hundreds of times, and most days, nothing happens. Most days, I finish my patrol, file my report, and grab a coffee back at the station. But that morning felt different. I can't explain it. Not in any way that would make sense to someone who hasn't spent time in these woods. The air was heavier than usual, clinging to my skin like it had weight. The light filtering through the canopy was dim and gray, and the silence, God, the silence, it was oppressive. Normally, you hear things: the rustle of a squirrel in the underbrush, the distant call of a raven, the creak of branches swaying in the breeze. But that morning there was nothing. Just the sound of water dripping from the trees, and my boots squelching in the mud. I was about 2 miles into the Hoh River Trail when I saw it. A backpack sitting just off the path, propped against the base of a massive Sitka spruce. It was bright blue, the kind of pack you'd buy at an outdoor store because the color makes it easy to spot. And it worked. Even in the gloom of the forest, that blue stood out like a beacon. I stopped walking and stared at it for a moment. My first thought was that someone had set it down to take a break and forgotten to pick it up. It happens more often than you'd think. People get distracted, take a few photos, and then wander off without realizing they've left something behind. But something about the way it was positioned didn't sit right with me. It wasn't tossed carelessly to the side. It was upright, the straps neatly arranged, like someone had placed it there deliberately. I walked over and crouched down beside it. The pack was dry, completely dry. Not a single drop of moisture on the fabric, despite the fact that everything around it, the tree, the ground, the ferns, was soaked. I ran my hand over the surface, half expecting to find dampness I'd missed. But no, it was bone dry. That didn't make sense. It had rained all night. I knew because I'd heard it drumming on the roof of my cabin before I fell asleep. Even if someone had left this pack here just an hour ago, it should have been wet. But it wasn't. I unzipped the main compartment and started going through the contents. A water bottle, half full. A granola bar, unopened. A fleece jacket, neatly folded, a first aid kit, still sealed in its plastic packaging, and at the bottom, a wallet. I pulled it out and flipped it open. The driver's license inside had a photo of a woman in her mid-30s, smiling at the camera. Her name was Grace Vickers, address in Seattle. I made a mental note of the details and slipped the wallet back into the pack. Everything about this felt wrong. The pack was too organized, too clean. If someone had been in distress, if they'd been injured or lost, they wouldn't have taken the time to arrange their belongings so neatly. And the dryness of it, that bothered me more than anything. It was like the pack had been placed here minutes ago, even though there was no one around. I stood up and looked around. The trail was empty in both directions, the forest silent except for the ever-present drip, drip, drip of water from the canopy. I called out, my voice cutting through the stillness. "Hello? Anyone out here?" Nothing, not even an echo. I pulled out my radio and keyed the mic. "Base, this is Hollowell. I've got a situation on the Hoh River Trail, about 2 miles in. Found an abandoned backpack. ID inside says Grace Vickers, Seattle address. Pack's dry, which doesn't add up given last night's rain. Requesting backup for a search." There was a crackle of static, and then the voice of dispatch. Rita, who'd been working the desk for longer than I'd been a ranger, came through. "Copy that, Hollowell. I'll send someone your way. ETA 20 minutes. You want me to run the name?" "Yeah, do that. And check if we've had any reports of missing hikers in the last 24 hours. Will do. Stay safe out there. Always." I clipped the radio back onto my belt and turned my attention to the ground around the backpack. If Grace Vickers had been here recently, there should be signs. Footprints, disturbed vegetation, something. I crouched down again and studied the area. The soil was soft from the rain, and sure enough, there were impressions in the mud. Boot prints, leading away from the pack and deeper into the forest off the main trail. But here's the thing that made my stomach tighten. The ground around the prints was wet, but the prints themselves had fresh water pooling in them. Not old rainwater that had settled overnight. Fresh water like it had just started collecting there. I touched the edge of one of the prints and my fingers came away damp. The water was still dripping into the impressions, even though the rain had stopped hours ago. I straightened up and looked at the canopy above me. The branches were thick with moss, and water was dripping steadily from them, hitting the ground in a slow, rhythmic patter. But the thing is, the water wasn't falling evenly. It was concentrated in a narrow line, almost like someone had disturbed the branches recently, shaking loose the moisture trapped there. I followed the line of drips with my eyes, tracing them back to the point where they started. They led in the same direction as the boot prints, into a denser part of the forest where the undergrowth was thick and tangled. The trail didn't go that way. There was no reason for anyone to head in that direction unless they were lost, or looking for something specific. I took a deep breath and stepped off the trail, following the prints. The forest closed in around me almost immediately. The trees here were older, their trunks wider, their roots twisting through the ground like veins. The moss hung in thick curtains from the branches, and the air felt even heavier, like I was walking into the mouth of something vast and ancient. The boot prints were easy to follow at first. They were clear and distinct, pressed deep into the mud. But after about 50 yards, they started to get erratic. The stride was uneven, the prints sometimes overlapping like the person had been stumbling or moving quickly. I paused and scanned the area. There was no sign of a struggle, no torn clothing, no broken branches, nothing to suggest she'd been attacked or dragged. But the prints told a story of someone who was either in a hurry or not thinking clearly. I kept moving, my senses on high alert. The silence was unnerving. Even the sound of dripping water seemed muted here, swallowed by the density of the forest. I felt like I was being watched, though I knew that was just my mind playing tricks on me. The forest does that to you if you're not careful. It makes you feel small and exposed, like you're trespassing in a place you don't belong. The prince led me to a clearing, or what passed for a clearing in a rainforest this dense. The trees opened up slightly, and the ground was covered in a thick carpet of ferns and moss. In the center of the clearing was a fallen log, massive and ancient, its bark long since rotted away. And sitting on top of the log, almost like it had been placed there, was a single hiking boot. I stopped in my tracks and stared at it. The boot was wet, soaked through, and covered in mud. It was the same brand as the prince I'd been following, and I didn't need to check the size to know it belonged to Grace Vickers. But why was it here? Why just one boot? I walked over and picked it up, turning it over in my hands. The laces were still tied, but they'd been pulled tight, like someone had been trying to keep the boot secure. There were no signs of damage, no tears, no blood, nothing to suggest it had been forcibly removed. It was just there. Sitting on a log in the middle of the forest, wet and muddy, like it had been waiting for me to find it. I set the boot down and looked around the clearing. The boot prints continued past the log, but they were fainter now, harder to follow, and they were smaller. Whoever had been wearing the boot was now walking with only one shoe, and their gait had changed. The prints were uneven, lopsided, like they were limping or struggling to keep their balance. I keyed my radio again. "Base, this is Hollowell. I've got a possible trail. Found a hiking boot, matches the pack. Prints suggest the subject is continuing on foot, likely injured or disoriented. I'm going to keep following." Rita's voice came back, tense now. "Copy that. Backup's en route. Hollowell, be careful. Don't go too far out. We don't want to lose you too." Understood. I clipped the radio back and kept moving. The prints led me deeper into the forest, into areas I didn't recognize. I'd been working this park for 7 years, and I thought I knew every trail, every landmark, every hidden corner. But this part of the forest felt unfamiliar, like I'd stepped into a different version of the same place. The trees were taller here, the shadows darker. The air was colder, too, and I could see my breath misting in front of me. The prints eventually led me to a stream. It was narrow, maybe 10 feet across, and the water was moving fast, swollen from the recent rain. The prints stopped at the edge of the stream, and I crouched down to get a closer look. The soil at the water's edge was disturbed, like someone had stepped into the stream, but I couldn't see any prints on the other side. Either Grace had crossed, and the current had washed away her tracks, or she'd followed the stream in one direction or the other. I stood up and looked both ways. Upstream, the forest was dense and dark, the stream disappearing into a tangle of roots and moss. Downstream, the trees opened up slightly, and I could see the faint outline of a ridge in the distance. I made a decision and started heading downstream, keeping the stream on my left. The terrain was rough. The ground was uneven, covered in rocks and fallen branches, and I had to watch every step to avoid twisting an ankle. The sound of the stream was loud here, rushing and churning, and it masked any other noises. I couldn't hear the forest anymore, couldn't hear the dripping water or the rustle of wind through the trees. It was just the stream, constant and overwhelming. I'd been walking for about 15 minutes when I saw it. A figure standing on the opposite bank, maybe 100 yards ahead. I froze and squinted through the gloom, trying to make out details. The figure was still, not moving, and for a moment I thought it might be a tree stump or a trick of the light. But then it shifted, just slightly, and I knew it was a person. "Grace?" I called out, my voice barely audible over the sound of the water. "Grace Vickers?" The figure didn't respond. It just stood there, facing away from me, its posture rigid and unnatural. I felt a chill run down my spine, and every instinct I had was telling me to turn around and go back. But I couldn't. Grace was out here somewhere, and if that was her, I needed to help. I started moving toward the figure, keeping my eyes locked on it. The stream was too wide to cross here, so I followed the bank, looking for a place where I could get across. The figure remained motionless, and the closer I got, the more wrong it looked. The proportions were off somehow, the limbs too long, the stance too stiff. I was about 50 yards away when the figure turned. Not slowly, not hesitantly, but all at once, like it had been waiting for me to get close enough. And when it faced me, I realized it wasn't Grace. It wasn't human. I stopped walking, my heart hammering in my chest. The thing standing on the opposite bank was tall, taller than any person I'd ever seen, and its body was covered in moss and bark, like it had grown out of the forest itself. Its face, if you could call it that, was a blank expanse of wood and shadow, and it had no eyes, no mouth, no features at all. But I could feel it looking at me, could feel its attention focused on me like a weight pressing down on my chest. We stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at each other across the stream, and then, without warning, it turned and walked back into the forest, its movements jerky and unnatural. Within seconds it was gone, swallowed by the trees and the shadows. I stood there, frozen, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. My hands were shaking and I could feel sweat running down my back despite the cold. Every rational part of my brain was screaming at me to leave, to turn around and get back to the trail, to call for backup and let someone else handle this. But I couldn't move. I just stood there, staring at the spot where the thing had disappeared, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. The radio crackled to life, and Rita's voice cut through the static. "Hollowell, this is Base. We've got your backup at the trailhead. Where are you?" I fumbled for the radio, my hands still shaking. I'm by the stream, about half a mile past the clearing. I trailed off, not sure how to explain what I'd just seen. "Hollowell, you okay?" I took a deep breath and forced myself to focus. Yeah, I'm fine. Tell them to follow the stream downstream. I'm going to keep moving." "Copy that. Stay in radio contact." I clipped the radio back and looked around. The forest was silent again, the only sound the rush of the stream beside me. I didn't know what I'd just seen, and I wasn't sure I wanted to. But Grace was still out here, and I wasn't going to leave without finding her. I started walking again, following the stream, my eyes scanning the trees for any sign of movement. The figure didn't reappear, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The forest felt alive now, not in the way it usually did, but in a way that made my skin crawl, like it was aware of me, aware of what I was doing, and it didn't like it. After another 10 minutes of walking, I found something. A piece of fabric, torn and muddy, caught on a branch near the water's edge. I pulled it free and examined it. It was dark blue, the same color as the fleece jacket I'd seen in Grace's backpack. She'd been here. Recently. I looked around trying to find more clues, and that's when I saw the second boot. It was lying in the middle of the stream, half submerged in the water, the laces tangled around a rock. I waded in, the cold water soaking through my pants, and grabbed it. The boot was heavy, filled with water, and I could see blood on the inside of the heel. Not a lot, but enough to make me worried. I stood there in the stream, holding the boot, and tried to piece together what had happened. Grace had lost one boot at the clearing, then continued walking. At some point, she'd torn her jacket, probably on a branch, and then she'd lost her second boot here in the stream. That meant she was barefoot now, walking through a forest full of sharp rocks and thorns, and God knows what else. I keyed the radio again. "Base, this is Hollowell. I've got more evidence. Found a torn piece of clothing and a second boot, both near the stream. Subject is likely barefoot and injured. I'm continuing the search." "Hollowell, backup is almost to your position. Wait for them before you go any farther." "Copy that." I climbed out of the stream and sat down on a rock, my legs aching and my mind racing. I didn't know what I was dealing with here. Grace Vickers had left her pack on the trail, walked into the forest, lost both her boots, and kept going. And somewhere along the way I'd seen something that didn't belong in any guidebook or training manual. I heard voices behind me, and I turned to see two rangers emerging from the trees. One of them was Martinez, a younger guy who'd joined the team about 2 years ago. The other was Davis, a veteran who'd been working the park longer than I had. They both looked tired, their uniforms muddy and their faces grim. "Hollowell," Martinez called out as they approached. "You okay?" "Yeah," I said, standing up. "I'm fine, but we've got a problem." Davis looked at the boot in my hand and frowned. "That hers?" "Yeah, found it in the stream. She's barefoot now, and there's blood. She's injured, and she's been walking for hours. We need to find her before hypothermia sets in." Martinez nodded and pulled out his map. "Where do you think she's headed?" I looked downstream toward the ridge I'd seen earlier. "My guess is she's following the water. It's the easiest route, and if she's disoriented, she might think it'll lead her back to the trail." Davis scanned the area, his eyes sharp. "Or she's lost and just wandering. Either way, we need to move fast. Let's split up. Martinez, you take the left bank. Hollowell, you stay on the right. I'll follow the stream from above, keep an eye on both of you." We spread out and started moving. The forest felt different now that I wasn't alone, less oppressive, but the unease was still there, gnawing at the back of my mind. I kept thinking about the figure I'd seen, the way it had moved, the way it had looked at me. I wanted to tell Davis and Martinez, but I didn't know how. What was I supposed to say? That I'd seen a 7-foot-tall moss creature staring at me from across a stream. They'd think I'd lost it. We searched for another hour, calling out Grace's name, scanning the ground for prints or signs of movement. But we found nothing. The forest had swallowed her up, and it wasn't giving her back. Eventually, Davis called us together. "We need to head back," he said, his voice heavy. "It's getting dark, and we're not going to find her like this. We'll regroup at the station, get more people out here, and start a full search at first light." I wanted to argue, to keep looking, but I knew he was right. Searching in the dark was a good way to get ourselves lost, and that wouldn't help anyone. We turned around and started making our way back to the trail, the forest closing in around us once more. As we walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that Grace was still out there, watching us leave. And somewhere, deeper in the woods, that thing, whatever it was watching too. We got back to the ranger station just after dark. The building sat at the edge of the park, a squat wooden structure with a green metal roof and windows that glowed warm yellow in the twilight. It looked inviting, safe, like a place where nothing bad could touch you. But I knew better. The station was just a thin barrier between us and the forest didn't care about walls or locks or the illusion of security. Davis pushed through the door first, and Martinez and I followed. The main room was busy. More rangers than I'd seen in one place in months. Rita was at the dispatch desk, talking into her headset, and there were at least 5 other rangers scattered around the room, some studying maps, others checking equipment. The air smelled like coffee and wet fabric, and the fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Captain Sullivan was standing by the map table, his arms crossed over his chest. He was a tall man in his late 50s, with gray hair cut military short and a face that looked like it had been carved from granite. He'd been running this station for 15 years, and in all that time, I'd never seen him look worried. But tonight, there were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there that morning. He looked up as we walked in. "Hollowell, Davis, Martinez, what have we got?" I set Grace's boot and the torn piece of fabric on the table. Subject is Grace Vickers, 34, from Seattle. Found her backpack on the Hoh River Trail around 06:30 this morning. Pack was dry despite last night's rain. Followed boot prints off trail. Found one boot in a clearing about half a mile in. Second boot in a stream maybe another quarter-mile past that. Also found this. I held up the piece of torn fabric. Matches the jacket in her pack. She's barefoot now, likely injured, and she's been out there for at least 12 hours, maybe longer. Sullivan studied the items on the table, his jaw tight. Any signs of what direction she was headed? She was following the stream downstream when we lost her trail. My guess is she's disoriented, possibly hypothermic. The terrain out there is rough, and without shoes. I trailed off. We all knew what that meant. Sullivan nodded slowly. All right. We're mounting a full search at 0500 tomorrow. I want everyone suited up and ready to move. We'll divide the search area into grids and work systematically. Davis, you'll coordinate from here. Hollowell, Martinez, you're back out there with the first team. Yes, sir, we said in unison. Sullivan turned to Rita. Any word from Seattle PD on Grace Vickers? Family? Friends? Rita nodded, flipping through a notepad. Spoke with her roommate about an hour ago. Said Grace left 3 days ago for a solo hiking trip. She was supposed to check in yesterday but never did. Roommate filed a missing persons report this morning. No medical conditions we should know about, but the roommate said Grace had been stressed lately. Work issues, personal stuff. She thought the trip would help her clear her head. Stressed, Sullivan repeated, his tone flat. Great. So we might be dealing with someone who's not thinking clearly to begin with. Looks that way, Rita said. Sullivan sighed and rubbed his temples. All right, everyone get some rest. We've got a long day ahead of us tomorrow. The other rangers started filing out, heading to the bunks or their cars, but I stayed where I was. I couldn't shake the image of that thing I'd seen by the stream, the way it had stood there, watching me. I needed to tell someone, but I didn't know how to start. Hollowell, Sullivan said, snapping me out of my thoughts. You good? I hesitated, then nodded. Yeah, just... It was a long day. He studied me for a moment, his eyes sharp. You sure? You look like you've seen a ghost. The word hung in the air between us, and I almost laughed. A ghost. If only it were that simple. I'm fine, sir, just tired. Sullivan didn't look convinced, but he didn't push. Get some rest. I need you sharp tomorrow. Yes, sir. I grabbed a cup of coffee from the pot in the corner and headed to the bunk room. The room was small, just 4 beds and a couple of lockers, and it smelled like old socks and pine sol. Martinez was already there, stretched out on one of the bunks with his boots still on, staring at the ceiling. You think we'll find her? He asked, without looking at me. I sat down on the bed across from him and took a sip of coffee. It was bitter and lukewarm, but I didn't care. I don't know. I hope so. She's been out there a long time, Martinez said. Barefoot, injured, no supplies. The odds aren't good. I know. He turned his head to look at me. You saw something out there, didn't you? When you were by the stream. You saw something. I set the coffee down and met his eyes. Martinez was young, but he wasn't stupid. He'd picked up on my unease, the way I'd been quiet during the walk back. What makes you say that? Because I've been out there too, he said quietly. I've been in those woods at night, and I've felt it. That feeling like something's watching you, like the forest is alive and it knows you're there. I didn't say anything for a long moment. Then I asked, You ever see anything? Anything you couldn't explain? Martinez hesitated, then nodded. Once, about 6 months ago, I was doing a solo patrol near the coast, and I saw something moving in the trees. It was big, way bigger than a person, and it moved wrong, like it was, I don't know, like it was trying to mimic how a person walks, but couldn't quite get it right. I watched it for maybe 10 seconds, and then it disappeared. I told myself it was a bear or a trick of the light, but I knew it wasn't. Did you report it? He shook his head. What was I supposed to say? That I saw a monster in the woods? They'd have pulled me off patrol and sent me to see a shrink. So I kept my mouth shut, but it's been eating at me ever since. I leaned back against the wall and closed my eyes. I saw something today, too. By the stream. It was tall, covered in moss and bark, and it didn't have a face. It just stood there, watching me. And then it walked back into the forest like it was nothing. Jesus, Martinez breathed. You think it took Grace? I don't know, but I think whatever it was, it's connected to her disappearance. She didn't just get lost. Something led her off the trail. Something made her leave her pack and her boots and keep walking even though she had to know it was dangerous. Martinez sat up, his expression grim. So, what do we do? We find her, I said, and we hope we're not too late. We were up before dawn the next morning, assembling in the main room of the station with the rest of the search team. There were 12 of us in total, plus Captain Sullivan coordinating from base. We divided into 4 groups of 3 and spread out across the search area, each team equipped with radios, first aid kits, and emergency flares. My team consisted of me, Martinez, and a ranger named Jackson, who'd transferred in from Yellowstone a few months ago. Jackson was quiet, methodical, the kind of guy who didn't say much but didn't miss anything either. He'd been briefed on the situation and seemed unfazed, but then again, Jackson always seemed unfazed. We headed back to the spot where I'd found the second boot, and from there we started working our way downstream. The morning was cold and damp, the fog so thick we could barely see 20 feet in front of us. The sound of the stream was muffled, and the forest felt even more claustrophobic than it had the day before. We called out Grace's name as we walked, our voices echoing through the trees. Grace! Grace Vickers! Can you hear us? Nothing. Just the sound of water and the crunch of our boots on the wet ground. After about an hour, Jackson found something. Over here, he called, crouching down near the base of a tree. Martinez and I jogged over and looked at what he was pointing at. It was a handprint, pressed into the mud, the fingers splayed wide like someone had been trying to push themselves up. That's fresh, Jackson said. Maybe a few hours old. I looked around, scanning the area. Grace, if you can hear me, stay where you are. We're here to help. Still nothing. We kept moving, following the stream and searching for more signs. Every few minutes we'd find something, a broken branch, a footprint, a smear of blood on a rock. Grace was leaving a trail, whether she meant to or not, and we were getting closer. Then Martinez stopped abruptly. Do you hear that? I froze and listened. At first, I didn't hear anything except the stream, but then I caught it. A faint sound, like someone crying. It was coming from somewhere ahead of us, deeper into the forest. Grace, I called out. Grace, is that you? The crying stopped. For a moment there was nothing, and then a voice, weak, hoarse, barely audible, floated back to us. Help, please. We broke into a run, crashing through the underbrush and jumping over fallen logs. The voice was getting louder, more distinct, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. We were close. We were so close. We burst into a small clearing, and there she was, Grace Vickers, sitting on the ground with her back against a tree, her arms wrapped around her knees. She was soaked from head to toe, her clothes torn and muddy, and her feet were bare and bloody. Her face was pale, her lips tinged blue, and her eyes were wide and unfocused. Grace, I said, dropping to my knees beside her. Grace, We're here. You're safe now." She looked at me, but it was like she wasn't really seeing me. Her eyes were glazed over, distant, and when she spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. I couldn't stop. I had to keep walking. It told me to. "Who told you to?" I asked gently, pulling off my jacket and draping it over her shoulders. "Grace, who told you to keep walking?" She didn't answer. She just stared past me, into the trees, her lips moving silently. Martinez keyed his radio. "Base, this is Martinez. We've got her. Subject is alive, but in bad shape. Requesting immediate medical evac to our location." "Copy that." Sullivan's voice crackled back. "Stay put. Stay. Helicopters en route. ETA 15 minutes. Jackson was already pulling out the first aid kit, checking Grace's vitals and wrapping her feet in bandages. "She's hypothermic," he said. "Pulse is weak, breathing's shallow. We need to get her warm." I pulled out an emergency blanket and wrapped it around her, rubbing her arms to try to get her circulation going. "Grace, stay with us. Help is on the way. You're going to be okay." But Grace wasn't listening. She was still staring into the trees, her lips still moving, and I realized she was repeating something under her breath. I leaned closer and listened. "It's still watching," she whispered. "It's always watching." A chill ran down my spine, and I looked over my shoulder, scanning the forest. For a moment, I thought I saw movement. A shadow shifting between the trees, too tall and too thin to be human, but when I blinked, it was gone. The helicopter arrived 10 minutes later, the sound of its rotors cutting through the fog like a knife. They lowered a stretcher, and we strapped Grace in, securing her as tightly as we could. As they lifted her up, she reached out and grabbed my wrist, her grip surprisingly strong. "Don't go back there," she said, her eyes locking onto mine. "Don't go into the deep forest. It doesn't want us there." "What doesn't?" I asked. "Grace, what did you see?" But she was already being pulled away, the helicopter lifting her up and out of the clearing. Within seconds, she was gone, swallowed by the fog. We stayed at the clearing for a while after the helicopter left, collecting evidence and documenting the scene. Jackson took photos, Martinez made notes, and I just stood there trying to process what Grace had said. It doesn't want us there. What did that mean? And what had she seen? As we were packing up to leave, I noticed something at the edge of the clearing, a shape carved into the bark of a tree. I walked over and ran my fingers over it. It was rough, jagged, like someone had used a knife or a sharp rock. The shape was vaguely humanoid but wrong, too tall, too thin, with no face, just a blank oval where the head should be. "Guys," I called out. "Come look at this." Martinez and Jackson came over, and we all stood there, staring at the carving. Nobody said anything for a long moment. Finally, Jackson spoke. "She didn't do this. Her hands were too damaged. She couldn't have carved something this detailed." "Then who did?" Martinez asked. I didn't have an answer, but as I stood there, looking at that faceless figure carved into the tree, I felt the same sensation I'd felt the day before. The feeling of being watched. The feeling that the forest was alive and aware, and it knew exactly what we were doing. We left the clearing and headed back to the station, but I couldn't shake the image of that carving from my mind. And I couldn't forget Grace's words. "It's still watching." Grace Vickers was transported to Olympic Medical Center in Port Angeles. I called the hospital that evening to check on her condition, and the nurse told me she was stable but unresponsive. She hadn't spoken since the helicopter picked her up, just stared at the ceiling with that same distant look in her eyes. They were treating her for severe hypothermia, dehydration, and multiple lacerations on her feet, but physically she was expected to make a full recovery. Mentally, though, that was a different story. I asked if I could visit her, and the nurse said they'd moved her to the psychiatric ward for observation. That's when I knew something was really wrong. They don't move you to psych unless you're a danger to yourself or others, or unless you've completely checked out of reality. The next morning, I drove to Port Angeles. It's about a 2-hour drive from the ranger station, winding through dense forest and along the coast. The day was overcast, the sky a flat gray that matched my mood. I kept thinking about that carving in the tree, the faceless figure with its 2 long limbs. I kept thinking about Grace's words. It's still watching. The hospital was a modern building, all glass and steel, standing in stark contrast to the old-growth forest that surrounded the area. I parked in the visitor lot and made my way inside, showing my ranger ID at the front desk. The receptionist directed me to the 3rd floor, psychiatric ward, and gave me a visitor badge. The psych ward was quieter than the rest of the hospital. The hallways were painted a soft blue, and the lights were dimmed to a comfortable level. I found Grace's room number, 317, and knocked gently on the door. A nurse opened it, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a tired smile. "You must be Ranger Hollowell," she said. "I'm Nurse Patterson. I've been looking after Grace." "How is she?" I asked. Patterson's smile faded. "Physically, she's improving. We've got her hydrated, her body temperature is back to normal, and we've treated her wounds, but mentally..." She shook her head. "She hasn't spoken more than a few words since she arrived. She just sits there, staring at nothing. Sometimes she whispers to herself, but we can't make out what she's saying." "Can I see her?" "Of course. But please, don't push her. If she doesn't want to talk, respect that." I nodded and stepped into the room. Grace was sitting in a chair by the window, wrapped in a hospital gown and a blanket. Her hair was clean now, pulled back in a loose ponytail, and the color had returned to her face, but her eyes, those eyes were still empty, still distant. I pulled up a chair and sat down beside her. "Grace, it's Ian Hollowell. I'm one of the rangers who found you in the forest. Do you remember me?" She didn't respond, just kept staring out the window at the trees beyond the parking lot. "Grace, I need to ask you some questions. About what happened out there, about what you saw." Still nothing. But then, slowly, her lips began to move. I leaned closer, straining to hear. "The tall man," she whispered. "He doesn't have a face. He doesn't have a face, but he sees everything." My blood ran cold. "The tall man? Grace, where did you see him?" "In the forest. He was standing by the trees. He didn't move, but I could feel him watching me. And then he started following me." "Did he hurt you?" She shook her head slowly. "He didn't touch me. He just walked behind me. Always just far enough away that I couldn't see him clearly. But I knew he was there. I could feel him. Why didn't you stop? Why did you keep walking?" Grace's hands tightened around the blanket, her knuckles white. "Because I couldn't stop. Every time I tried to turn around, every time I tried to go back, he was there, blocking the path. So I kept walking. I walked and walked until I couldn't walk anymore." "Grace, did he say anything to you?" She was quiet for a long moment, and I thought she wasn't going to answer. But then she turned to look at me, and for the first time since I'd entered the room, her eyes focused, really focused. "He didn't speak," she said, "but I heard him anyway, in my head. He told me that the forest doesn't belong to us, that we're trespassing, that if we don't leave, we'll become part of it, just like he did." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What do you mean, just like he did?" "He used to be like us," Grace whispered. "He used to be human, but the forest took him. It took him and made him into something else, and now he watches. He watches, and he waits for the next one. Before I could ask another question, Grace turned back to the window, her expression going blank again. It was like a door had slammed shut, and I knew I wasn't going to get anything else out of her. I thanked Nurse Patterson and left the hospital, my mind racing. He used to be human. The words echoed in my head as I drove back to the station. If what Grace said was true, if that thing in the forest really had been a person once, then what did that mean for the rest of us? How many others had the forest taken? How many were still out there watching, waiting? When I got back to the ranger station, the place was buzzing with activity. Captain Sullivan had called a mandatory meeting and all the rangers were gathered in the main room. I slipped in quietly and took a seat at the back. Sullivan stood at the front of the room, his expression grim. "All right, listen up. I know you're all tired, and I know the Grace Vickers case has been weighing on everyone. But we've got another problem." He pulled up a map on the projector screen, showing the park boundaries and the surrounding areas. Red pins were scattered across the map, clustered mostly around the Hoh Rain Forest and the coastal trails. "These pins represent disappearances over the last 10 years, Sullivan continued. "Some of them were tourists, some were locals, a few were other rangers. Most of them were never found. The ones who were found—" He paused, his jaw tightening. "The ones who were found came back different, traumatized, unable or unwilling to talk about what happened to them." I felt my stomach drop. I'd known people went missing in the park. It was an unfortunate reality of working in such a vast, remote area. But seeing all those pins clustered together, seeing the pattern, made it real in a way that statistics never could. "There's something out there," Sullivan said. "Something we don't understand. And it's been here a long time. Longer than this park, longer than any of us. The local tribes have stories about it. Stories about a spirit that guards the forest, that punishes those who show disrespect or venture too deep. They call it different names. The Watcher, the Tall One, the Faceless Man." Martinez spoke up from the front row. "So, what do we do? We can't just tell people not to hike in the park. That's our whole job." "We don't tell them not to hike," Sullivan said. "But we do warn them. We make sure they understand the risks. We keep them on the marked trails, and we respond immediately if anyone reports seeing anything unusual. And most importantly, we don't go into the deep forest alone. Not anymore. From now on, all patrols are done in pairs, minimum, no exceptions." There were murmurs of agreement around the room, but I could see the fear in people's eyes. We'd all chosen this job because we loved the wilderness, because we wanted to protect it. But how do you protect people from something you don't understand? How do you fight something that's been here since before the land had a name? After the meeting, I pulled Sullivan aside. "Captain, I need to tell you something. About what I saw out there." He looked at me, his expression unreadable. "Go on." I told him everything. About the figure by the stream, the way it had moved, the way it had looked at me. I told him about the carving on the tree and what Grace had said at the hospital. When I finished, Sullivan was quiet for a long moment. "You believe her?" he asked finally. "You believe this thing used to be human?" "I don't know what I believe," I admitted. "But I know what I saw, and I know Grace wasn't making it up. She was terrified, Captain. Whatever's out there, it's real and it's dangerous." Sullivan nodded slowly. "All right. I'll add your report to the file. But Hollowell, I need you to keep this quiet. If word gets out that we're dealing with something supernatural, it'll cause a panic. People will stop coming to the park, and we'll lose funding. This station will shut down, and then who's going to protect the hikers?" "I understand," I said. even though part of me wanted to shout the truth from the rooftops. People had a right to know what they were walking into, but Sullivan was right. Panic wouldn't help anyone. Over the next few weeks, things went back to a semblance of normalcy. Grace Vickers was released from the hospital and returned to Seattle, though I heard through the grapevine that she'd quit her job and moved in with her parents. She never set foot in a forest again. I kept working my patrols, always in pairs now, always keeping an eye out for anything unusual, and I found things, small things at first, strange markings on trees, similar to the carving I'd seen in the clearing. Footprints that didn't belong to any animal I recognized. And sometimes, late at night, I'd hear sounds in the forest. Sounds like branches breaking or leaves rustling, even when there was no wind. Martinez and I talked about it sometimes, during slow shifts or over coffee at the station. He'd seen things too, though he never went into detail. None of us did. It was like an unspoken rule. We all knew something was out there, but talking about it made it too real, too present. Then, about a month after Grace's rescue, we got another call. A hiker had reported seeing something strange near the Spruce Nature Trail, one of the more popular routes in the park. The hiker, a man named Derek Thompson, said he'd been taking photos when he saw a figure standing in the trees about 50 yards off the trail. He thought it was another hiker at first, but when he called out, the figure didn't respond. It just stood there, watching. Derek took a photo, and when he looked at the screen to review the shot, the figure was gone. Sullivan sent me and Jackson to investigate. We arrived at the Spruce Nature Trail around noon, the forest alive with the sounds of birdsong and rustling leaves. Derek was waiting for us at the trailhead, his camera clutched in his hands. "Thanks for coming," he said, his voice shaky. "I know this sounds crazy, but I swear I saw something." "It's not crazy," I assured him. "Can we see the photo?" He handed me the camera, and I pulled up the image he'd taken. It showed the forest, dense and green, with shafts of sunlight filtering through the canopy. And there, just barely visible between two trees, was a shape. It was tall and thin, with limbs that seemed too long, and where its face should have been there was nothing, just a smooth, blank surface. I felt my pulse quicken. "Where exactly did you see this?" Derek pointed. "Right there. About 50 yards in, I can show you." "No," I said quickly. "You stay here, we'll check it out." Jackson and I left Derek at the trailhead and made our way into the forest. The air was cooler here, away from the trail, and the light was dimmer. I kept my hand on my radio, ready to call for backup if we needed it. We found the spot where Derek had been standing and looked in the direction he'd pointed. There was nothing there now, just trees and undergrowth. But as we got closer, I noticed something. The ground was disturbed, the soil freshly turned, like something had been standing there recently. And then I saw it, another carving, this one on a tree about 20 feet away. The same faceless figure, the same elongated limbs. But this time there was something else. Words, carved beneath the figure in rough, uneven letters. "Turn back." Jackson stepped up beside me, his face pale. "We need to report this." "Yeah," I said quietly. "We do." We took photos, documented the scene, and then got the hell out of there. As we walked back to the trailhead, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. That somewhere in the trees, hidden in the shadows, that thing was standing there, waiting. And I knew, with absolute certainty, that this wasn't over. Whatever was out there, it wasn't going to stop. It was going to keep watching, keep taking, until someone did something about it. But what could we do? How do you fight something that's part of the forest itself? How do you protect people from a threat they can't see, can't understand, can't even believe in? I didn't have the answers. But as I stood there looking back at the trees, I made a promise to myself. I was going to find out. No matter what it took, no matter how long it took, I was going to find out what that thing was and how to stop it. Because if I didn't, more people were going to disappear, and sooner or later one of them might not come back at all. The weeks that followed were tense. We increased patrols, posted warnings at every trailhead, and started keeping a log of unusual sightings. The reports came in steadily. Hikers who'd seen figures in the trees, campers who'd heard footsteps circling their tents at night, even a family who claimed their 6-year-old son had talked to the tall man while they were eating lunch at a picnic area. The boy said the man had no face but was very sad. That last report bothered me more than I wanted to admit. If what Grace said was true, if this thing really had been human once, then what had happened to make it this way? What had the forest done to him? I started spending my off hours researching. I went to the local library and dug through old newspapers, looking for any mentions of disappearances or strange occurrences in the area. I found plenty. Articles dating back to the early 1900s, stories of loggers who'd vanished, hunters who'd never come home, settlers who'd walked into the forest and were never seen again. Some of the articles mentioned local Native American tribes warning newcomers about the forest, about spirits that dwelled in the deep places where sunlight never reached. One article in particular caught my attention. It was from 1947, yellowed and brittle, the ink faded but still legible. The headline read, "Search called off for missing forest ranger." The ranger's name was Thomas Wardell, and according to the article, he'd been conducting a solo patrol in what was then called the Hoh River Valley. He'd radioed in to report strange markings on trees and mentioned feeling like he was being followed. That was the last anyone heard from him. They searched for 3 weeks. Found his truck at the trailhead, his pack near a stream about 2 miles in, but no sign of Thomas himself. The search was eventually called off, and Thomas Wardell was declared dead, though his body was never recovered. I sat there in the library staring at the article and felt a chill run through me. Thomas Wardell. Could he be the thing in the forest? Had he been taken, transformed, turned into whatever Grace and the others had seen? I made copies of the article and several others, then drove back to the station. Sullivan was in his office going over reports, and I knocked on the doorframe. "Got a minute, Captain?" He looked up, his reading glasses perched on his nose. "Hollowell, come in. What have you got?" I laid the articles out on his desk. "I've been doing some research, looking into disappearances in the area going back decades. I found something interesting. A ranger named Thomas Wardell went missing in 1947 right here in the Hoh Valley. Never found. And look at this." I pointed to the relevant passage. He reported strange markings on trees and said he felt like he was being followed. Sullivan read through the article, his expression growing darker with each line. When he finished, he sat back in his chair and removed his glasses. "You think Wardell is what we're dealing with?" "I think it's possible. Grace said the thing in the forest used to be human. If Wardell got lost out there, if something happened to him, he'd be over 90 years old by now," Sullivan interrupted. "Even if he survived, even if he's still out there somehow, that doesn't explain what he is or why he's doing this." "Maybe age doesn't matter anymore," I said. "Maybe whatever the forest did to him changed that. Changed everything." Sullivan rubbed his eyes, looking suddenly exhausted. "This is insane. You know that, right? We're sitting here talking about a missing ranger from 1947 who somehow becomes some kind of forest guardian or monster or whatever the hell this thing is. I know how it sounds, but Captain, we've both seen the evidence, we've read the reports. Something is out there, and people keep seeing it. If there's even a chance that it's connected to Thomas Wardell, don't we owe it to everyone, to him, to find out?" Sullivan was quiet for a long moment, then nodded. "All right, but we do this carefully. No more solo investigations, no more taking risks. If we're going to look into this, we do it by the book. Understood?" "Yes, sir." We organized a small team. Me, Jackson, Martinez, and Sullivan himself. We went out on a clear morning, the kind of day where the forest felt almost peaceful, where you could almost forget about the darkness that lurked in the deep places. We hiked to the area where Thomas Wardell's pack had been found, using the old reports and maps to guide us. The forest had changed in 70-plus years, of course. Trees had fallen and new ones had grown. The stream had shifted its course slightly, carving new channels through the rock. But the place still had a presence, a weight to it that pressed down on us as we moved through the undergrowth. We searched for hours, looking for anything that might give us answers. And then Martinez called out, "Over here, I found something." We converged on his position. He was standing in a small hollow, surrounded by ancient cedars, their trunks so massive it would take 4 people holding hands to circle one. And there, carved into the bark of the largest tree, was writing. Old writing, the letters rough and deep, like they'd been cut with a knife. Thomas Wardell. 1947. The forest took me. I can't leave. Below that, in fresher carvings, were dozens of tally marks. I counted them, 273. "What are the tally marks for?" Martinez asked quietly. "Days," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Or maybe years. Maybe he's been keeping track of time." Sullivan stepped closer, running his hand over the carved letters. "If this is really Thomas Wardell, if he's been out here all this time—" He trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Jackson was examining the base of the tree. "There's something else here. Looks like bones." We all moved closer. Half buried in the moss and soil were skeletal remains, small animals mostly. Rabbits, squirrels, birds. They were arranged in a pattern, almost like an offering. "He's been surviving out here," Jackson said. "Hunting. Living off the land for 70 years. But why?" Martinez asked. "Why not come back? Why not ask for help?" I looked at the carving again. The forest took me. I can't leave. Maybe he can't. Maybe whatever happened to him, whatever the forest did, it bound him here somehow, made him part of it. As if in response to my words, I heard it, a sound like branches breaking, coming from deeper in the forest. We all tensed, hands going to our radios instinctively. And then he appeared. The tall man, the faceless one, Thomas Wardell. He stood at the edge of the hollow, maybe 30 feet away, his form partially obscured by shadow and moss. He was tall, impossibly tall, his body covered in bark and lichen, his limbs elongated and twisted, and where his face should have been there was nothing, just smooth, weathered wood. But I could feel him looking at us, feel his attention heavy and ancient and sad. Nobody moved, nobody spoke. We just stood there, 4 rangers in a forest hollow, staring at something that shouldn't exist. And then Thomas, because I knew now, with absolute certainty that's who this was, raised one long arm and pointed. Not at us, but past us, back toward the trail, back toward safety. The message was clear. Leave. Sullivan found his voice first. "Thomas Wardell, is that you?" The figure didn't respond, just stood there, arms still pointing. "We want to help you," Sullivan continued, his voice steadier now. "We know what happened. We know you've been out here. But you don't have to be alone anymore. Come back with us. Let us help you." For a moment, I thought he might. I thought I saw something shift in his posture, something almost human. But then he lowered his arm and turned away, melting back into the forest like smoke. "Wait!" I called out, starting forward, but Jackson grabbed my arm. "Don't. He told us to leave. We should listen." I wanted to argue, wanted to chase after him, to demand answers. But Jackson was right. We'd pushed far enough. We'd found what we came for. Confirmation that Thomas Wardell was real, that he was still out here, that he was the thing people had been seeing. But we still didn't know how to help him. We returned to the station and filed our reports. Sullivan made the decision to keep the details classified, sharing them only with park headquarters and the local tribal council. The elders weren't surprised. They told us that the forest had always had guardians, spirits that kept watch over the old places. Sometimes people who ventured too deep, who showed disrespect or got lost, would be claimed by the forest. Transformed, made into something between human and nature. "Can it be reversed?" I asked Elder Running Deer, a woman in her 80s who'd spent her entire life in the shadow of these mountains. She shook her head slowly. "Once the forest claims you, you belong to it. Thomas Wardell made his choice whether he knew it or not. Now he serves a purpose. He protects the deep places. He warns those who would go too far. But he's suffering," I said. "You can feel it. He's trapped." "Yes," she agreed. "And that is his burden to bear. The forest does not give without taking. It does not protect without sacrifice." I left that meeting feeling hollowed out. We'd found answers, but they weren't the ones I wanted. There was no way to save Thomas Wardell, no way to bring him back. He was part of the forest now, and he would remain so until the trees themselves fell. 3 months have passed since that day in the hollow. The sightings have decreased, but they haven't stopped. Every few weeks, someone reports seeing the tall man, always in the deep forest, always watching. We warn hikers to stay on marked trails, to respect the boundaries we've established. Most listen. Some don't. Last week, a teenager ignored our warnings and ventured off trail with his friends. They wanted to find the faceless man, wanted to take photos for social media. We found them 6 hours later, huddled together near a stream, all 3 blind and terrified. Their sight returned after 3 days, just like Grace's had, just like all the others. They won't talk about what they saw. But they'll never hike in these woods again. As for me, I'm still here, still doing my patrols, still watching the forest. I think about Thomas Wardell often, about the choice he made or that was made for him, about the weight of spending 70 years alone in the wilderness, neither fully human nor fully something else. Sometimes, on quiet nights when I'm doing paperwork at the station, I'll look out the window toward the tree line. And sometimes, not often, but sometimes, I'll see a shape standing there in the shadows. Tall and still and watching. I don't approach it anymore. I just nod, a small acknowledgement from one guardian to another. And then I go back to my work, knowing that out there in the deep forest, Thomas Wardell is doing his job, protecting the places we're not meant to go, warning us to turn back before it's too late. The forest has its rules, and Thomas Wardell is one of them. We can't save him, but we can honor him by doing our job, by keeping people safe, by respecting the boundaries between our world and the one he now inhabits. That's all any of us can do. That's all the forest asks. And maybe, in some small way, that's enough. The call came in at 11:47 p.m., just as I was getting ready to close up the ranger station for the night. I'd been on duty since 6 that morning, and my body was screaming for sleep. But the voice on the other end of the line, a woman, breathless and scared, made me forget all about my aching feet and heavy eyelids. "There are lights," she said, "out on the lake. multiple lights moving around, but there's no one supposed to be camping there tonight. I checked the permits before I set up my tent. My name is Clara Whitby, and I've been a ranger at Olympic National Park for 6 years. 6 years of dealing with lost hikers, illegal campers, wildlife encounters, and the occasional drunk tourist who thought it would be fun to climb a tree at midnight. But something about this call felt different. The woman's voice had an edge to it, a tremor that suggested she wasn't just reporting a permit violation. She was genuinely frightened. "Ma'am, can you tell me your name and location?" I asked, already pulling on my jacket and grabbing my flashlight. Jennifer Rossi. I'm at Lake Crescent, the Fairholme campground, Site 14. The lights are out on the water, maybe a quarter mile from shore. They've been there for about 20 minutes now. Lake Crescent, a deep, glacially carved lake surrounded by steep mountains and dense forest. Beautiful during the day, but at night, it transformed into something else entirely. The water was so clear you could see 30 feet down in daylight, but at night, it became an impenetrable black mirror that reflected nothing but darkness. "Are the lights moving in any particular pattern?" I asked, clipping my radio to my belt. "They're just drifting, like someone's walking around out there with lanterns. But that doesn't make sense. There's nothing out there. No island, no dock, nothing. Just deep water." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Jennifer, I need you to stay in your tent and lock yourself in. Don't go near the water. I'm on my way. Should be there in about 15 minutes. "Okay," she said, her voice small. "Please hurry." I hung up and radioed dispatch. Rita was still on duty, thank God. She'd been working the night shift for years and knew how to handle unusual situations. "Rita, this is Whitby. I've got a report of unauthorized lights on Lake Crescent near Fairholme. I'm heading out to investigate. Can you send back up?" "Copy that, Whitby. Nearest unit is Martinez, but he's about 30 minutes out. You want to wait for him?" I thought about Jennifer Rossi, alone in her tent, watching strange lights drift across the water. "Negative. I'll assess the situation and call if I need assistance." "Be careful out there." "Always am." I grabbed my emergency kit, made sure my radio was fully charged, and headed out to my truck. The night was cold and damp, typical for late October in the Pacific Northwest. A thick fog had rolled in from the coast, reducing visibility to maybe 50 feet. My headlights cut through the mist like twin blades, illuminating the narrow road that wound through the forest toward Lake Crescent. The drive took longer than I'd estimated. The fog was worse than I'd thought, and I had to slow down to a crawl on some of the tighter curves. The forest pressed in on both sides of the road, the trees looming like dark sentinels. Normally, I found the forest comforting, even at night. But tonight, something felt off. The usual sounds, owls hooting, branches creaking in the wind, were absent. It was too quiet, like the forest was holding its breath. When I finally reached the Fairholme campground, it was nearly midnight. The place was almost empty, just a handful of tents scattered across the designated sites. Most people didn't camp this late in the season. Too cold, too wet, and the days were getting shorter. But there were always a few diehards who loved the solitude. I parked near Site 14 and grabbed my flashlight. Jennifer's tent was a small dome-style setup, the kind you could buy at any outdoor store. I approached slowly, making sure to announce myself. "Jennifer, it's Ranger Whitby. I'm here to check on those lights." The tent zipper opened immediately, and a woman's face appeared. She was in her mid-30s with short dark hair and wide, frightened eyes. "Thank God you're here. They're still out there. Look." She pointed toward the lake, and I turned to follow her gaze. At first, I didn't see anything. The lake was shrouded in fog, the water invisible beyond the first few feet of shoreline. But then I saw them. Pale, diffuse lights, glowing softly through the mist. They were moving slowly, drifting across the surface of the water like fireflies. There were 4 of them, maybe 5. It was hard to tell through the fog. They weren't bright enough to be flashlights or lanterns, more like the glow of a candle, weak and flickering. And they were definitely over the water, not on the shore. "How long have they been there?" I asked, my voice low. "Over an hour now. I called you as soon as I saw them. At first I thought maybe it was bioluminescence or something, but that doesn't happen in fresh water, does it?" "No," I said. "It doesn't." I pulled out my binoculars and tried to get a better look, but the fog made it impossible to see any detail. The lights were real, though. I wasn't imagining them, and neither was Jennifer. But what the hell were they? "Stay here," I told her. "I'm going to get closer to the shore and see if I can figure out what's going on." "Be careful," she said, her voice shaking. I made my way down to the water's edge, my boots crunching on the rocky beach. The air was colder here, and I could feel the moisture from the fog settling on my skin. The lights were about 200 yards out, drifting slowly across the surface. There was no pattern to their movement, no sense that they were being controlled by anyone. They just floated, aimless and silent. I keyed my radio. "Rita, this is Whitby. I've got visual confirmation of the lights. No obvious source. They appear to be over the water, possibly 200 yards from shore. No boats visible, no campers, no equipment. I'm going to try to get a better look." "Copy that. Martinez is about 10 minutes out. You want him to join you?" "Yeah. Tell him to meet me at the Fairholme boat launch. I'm going to take one of the park boats out and see if I can get closer." "Whitby, are you sure that's a good idea? You don't know what you're dealing with." "I know, but I can't just stand here and watch. Someone could be in trouble out there." There was a pause, then Rita's voice came back, resigned. "All right, but keep your radio on and check in every 5 minutes. If I don't hear from you, I'm sending the Coast Guard." "Understood." I hiked back to my truck and drove to the boat launch, which was about half a mile down the road. The launch area was deserted, just a small dock and a couple of aluminum skiffs tied up for ranger use. I chose the smaller one, checked the fuel and the outboard motor, and pushed off into the water. The fog closed around me almost immediately. Within seconds, the shore disappeared, swallowed by the gray mist. The only sound was the gentle put-put-put of the outboard and the soft lapping of water against the hull. I kept my flashlight trained ahead of me, but it didn't do much good. The beam just reflected off the fog, creating a disorienting glow. I cut the engine and let the boat drift, listening. The lights were still out there, maybe 100 yards ahead of me now. I could see them more clearly from the water. 5 distinct points of pale, yellowish light. They hung about 3 feet above the surface, swaying gently like they were suspended on invisible strings. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing across the water. "This is Ranger Whitby with Olympic National Park. If anyone's out here, please identify yourself." No response. Just the sound of water and my own breathing. I started the engine again and moved slowly toward the lights. As I got closer, I realized something strange. The lights weren't reflecting on the water. Normal lights, flashlights, lanterns, even bioluminescence, would create some kind of reflection, some distortion on the surface. But these didn't. They just hung there, glowing softly, as if they existed in their own separate plane. I got within 50 feet and cut the engine again. This close, I could see that the lights weren't coming from any physical source. There were no lanterns, no flashlights, no glow sticks, just the light itself, floating in midair above the water. My skin prickled. This wasn't right. This wasn't natural. I keyed my radio. "Rita, I'm approximately 50 feet from the lights. No visible source. They appear to be self-luminous. I'm going to approach closer and see if I can—" One of the lights moved, not drifted, moved. It shot toward me with sudden, impossible speed, closing the distance in less than a second. I jerked backward instinctively, nearly falling out of the boat. The light stopped about 10 feet away, hovering at eye level. This close, I could see it wasn't a solid glow. It pulsed, fluctuating in intensity, and there was something inside it. A shape. Dark and indistinct, but definitely there. "Whitby! Whitby, come in!" Rita's voice crackled over the radio, but I couldn't respond. I was frozen, staring at the light, at the shadow within it. The shape moved, it shifted, unfolding, and for just a moment, just a fraction of a second, I saw it clearly. A human form, arms, legs, a head. But wrong, all wrong. The proportions were distorted, the limbs too long, the body too thin. And then the light pulsed again, and the shape was gone, dissolved back into the glow. The light retreated, drifting back toward the others. They clustered together for a moment, like they were communicating, and then they began to move. All 5 of them, gliding across the water in a slow, deliberate line. They were heading deeper into the lake, toward the center where the water was darkest and deepest. I grabbed my radio, my hands shaking. "Rita, I don't know what I just saw. The lights moved. One of them came right at me. There's something inside them, something—" I trailed off, not sure how to explain what I'd seen. "Whitby, get out of there. Now. Martinez is at the boat launch. Come back to shore." "Copy that." I started the engine and turned the boat around, my heart hammering in my chest. As I headed back toward the launch, I glanced over my shoulder. The lights were still moving, getting farther and farther away. And then, one by one, they began to descend. They sank beneath the surface of the water, the glow fading as they went deeper, until finally, there was nothing left but darkness. I reached the dock and found Martinez waiting, his flashlight trained on me as I tied up the boat. He was younger than me, maybe mid-20s, with the kind of boyish face that made tourists assume he was an intern. But he was sharp, competent, and he didn't rattle easily. "You okay?" he asked, reaching out to steady me as I climbed onto the dock. "Yeah, I think so. Did Rita fill you in?" "She said you saw lights on the water and went to investigate. She sounded worried." "With good reason." I told him what I'd seen. The lights, the shadow inside them, the way they'd descended into the water. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "You think it was some kind of equipment?" he finally asked. "Drones, maybe. There are drones now that can land on water." "Maybe," I said, though I didn't believe it. "But drones don't move like that, and they don't have shapes inside them." Martinez frowned. "Shapes? I saw something. Inside one of the lights. It looked almost human, but not quite. Like a shadow or a silhouette." He studied my face, trying to gauge if I was serious. "Clara, you've been on duty for almost 18 hours. Is it possible you were just tired? That your mind was playing tricks on you?" I wanted to say yes. I wanted to believe that exhaustion and fog and the strangeness of the situation had combined to make me see things that weren't there. But I knew what I'd seen. And more importantly, I knew what I'd felt. That cold, creeping dread that settled in my chest when the light moved toward me. That wasn't imagination. That was real. "I know what I saw," I said quietly. "But we need to document this. Take statements from Jennifer Rossi, search the area for any equipment or debris, and see if we can figure out what the hell is going on." Martinez nodded. "All right, let's start with the camper, then we'll do a sweep of the shoreline." We walked back to Jennifer's campsite. She was standing outside her tent now, wrapped in a blanket, her eyes scanning the water. When she saw us, she hurried over. "Did you find anything? What were those lights?" "We're still investigating," I told her. "Can you tell me exactly what you saw? Start from the beginning." She nodded, pulling the blanket tighter around herself. "I was getting ready for bed, maybe around 11:30. I stepped outside to brush my teeth, and that's when I saw them. 5 lights, out on the water. At first I thought maybe it was a boat, but there was no engine sound, no movement. They just hung there, glowing. I watched them for a few minutes and then they started moving. Slowly, at first, then faster. That's when I called you." "Did you notice anything else? Any sounds, smells, anything unusual?" She hesitated, then nodded. "The forest went quiet. I didn't think about it at the time, but now that you mention it, there were no sounds. No insects, no birds, nothing. It was like everything was holding its breath." I exchanged a glance with Martinez. The same thing had happened when I was driving to the lake. The unnatural silence. "Did the lights do anything else?" I asked. "Change color? Make any sounds?" "No, they just existed, but they felt wrong. Like they didn't belong here. Does that make sense?" "Yeah," I said. "It does." We took the rest of her statement, then did a thorough sweep of the shoreline. We found nothing. No equipment, no footprints, no signs that anyone had been there. The water was calm, undisturbed, as if nothing had happened at all. By the time we finished, it was nearly 2 in the morning. Martinez and I headed back to the ranger station, both of us silent. I knew he was thinking the same thing I was. Something had been out on that lake tonight. Something we couldn't explain. And somewhere, deep beneath the surface of Lake Crescent, it was still there. Waiting. I got maybe 3 hours of sleep before my phone rang. The sun hadn't even risen yet, and I could hear rain drumming against my cabin window. I fumbled for the phone, my eyes still heavy with exhaustion. "Whitby," I mumbled. "Clara, it's Sullivan." Captain Sullivan's voice was tight, controlled. That was never a good sign. "We've got a situation at Lake Crescent. A fisherman just called in. He found a backpack floating near the south shore. It's waterlogged, but there's ID inside. Name's Aaron Hollis, Seattle address. And Clara, the backpack matches the description of gear reported missing from Site 7 last night." I was instantly awake. Site 7? Someone was camping there? Apparently. We didn't have a permit on file, so either they didn't register or they were camping illegally. Either way, we need to get out there now. The fisherman pulled the pack out of the water and left it on the dock. I'm assembling a search team. Meet me at the lake in 30 minutes. On my way. I dressed quickly, pulling on my uniform and waterproof jacket. The rain was coming down hard now, the kind of steady downpour that could last for days in this part of Washington. I grabbed a thermos of coffee and headed out. The drive to Lake Crescent was different in daylight, though not by much. The sky was gray and heavy with clouds, and the rain created a curtain of water that made it hard to see more than a few car lengths ahead. The forest looked darker somehow, the trees dripping with moisture, their branches sagging under the weight of water. When I arrived at the South Shore dock, there were already 4 other rangers assembled. Sullivan was there, along with Martinez, and 2 others I recognized, Davidson and Reeves, both experienced search and rescue specialists. A small aluminum boat was tied to the dock, and sitting on the weathered wooden planks was a blue backpack, soaked through and dripping. Sullivan looked up as I approached. "Whitby, glad you're here. Martinez filled me in on what you saw last night. We need to talk about that. But first, let's deal with this." He gestured to the backpack. I crouched down beside it. The pack was a standard hiking model, the kind you'd use for a weekend camping trip. It was saturated with water, and small puddles had formed around it. I pulled on a pair of latex gloves and carefully unzipped the main compartment. Inside was exactly what you'd expect from a camper. A damp sleeping bag, a water bottle, some energy bars that had turned to mush, and a stuff sack with clothes. At the bottom, wrapped in a plastic bag that had partially protected it from the water, was a wallet. I opened it carefully. The driver's license inside showed a man in his late 20s with sandy brown hair and an easy smile. Aaron Hollis, age 28, Seattle address. There was also a credit card, some cash, and a photo. Aaron with a woman and a young boy, all three of them grinning at the camera. "He's got a family," I said quietly, showing Sullivan the photo. Sullivan's jaw tightened. "Reeves, get on the phone to Seattle PD. See if they can locate next of kin and find out when Aaron Hollis was last seen. Davidson, you and Martinez start a sweep of the shoreline, starting from where the fishermen found the pack and working your way around. Look for any signs of a camp, any equipment, anything that might tell us what happened." He turned to me. "Whitby, you're with me. We're going out on the water. If this man went in last night, there's a chance his body is still nearby. The lake's deep, but currents can keep things near the surface for a while." I nodded, though my stomach twisted at the thought. I'd done body recoveries before. It was never pleasant, and it never got easier. But it was part of the job. Sullivan and I took the boat out, moving slowly along the shoreline. The rain hammered against the water, creating a constant drumming sound that made it hard to think. We scanned the surface, looking for any sign of Aaron Hollis. Clothing, more gear, or worse, a body. "Tell me exactly what you saw last night," Sullivan said as we searched. "Martinez said you mentioned shapes inside the lights." I recounted the entire experience, the call from Jennifer Rossi, the lights on the water, how one of them had moved toward me with impossible speed, and the shadow inside it, the almost human form that had appeared for just a moment before, dissolving back into the glow. Sullivan was quiet for a long time after I finished. Then he said, "I've been working this park for 23 years. I've seen a lot of strange things. Weather phenomena, animal behavior that didn't make sense, equipment failures in places where there should have been no issues, but I've never seen anything like what you're describing. You think I imagined it?" "No," he said firmly. "I think you saw something real. I just don't know what it was. But Clara, there's something you should know. This isn't the first time we've had reports of lights on Lake Crescent." I turned to look at him. "What do you mean?" "It goes back years, decades even. There's a file at the station buried in the archives. Reports from rangers, campers, fishermen, all of them describing the same thing. Pale lights on the water, usually at night, usually in this part of the lake. Most people dismiss them as reflections, or boats, or natural phenomena. But some of the reports—" He trailed off, his expression troubled. "Some of them what?" "Some of them mention disappearances, people who saw the lights and then vanished. There's a pattern, though it's not consistent enough to prove anything. But it's there if you know how to look for it." A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the rain. How many disappearances? Over the last 50 years? Maybe a dozen. Some of them were ruled accidents, drownings, falls, hypothermia. Others were never solved. The bodies were never found. It's easy to write them off as coincidence. Lakes are dangerous. People make mistakes. But when you put all the reports together, when you see the pattern, you start to wonder, I finished. "Yeah, you do." We continued searching for another 2 hours, but we found nothing. No body, no additional gear, no signs of Aaron Hollis. It was like he'd simply ceased to exist. When we returned to the dock, Martinez and Davidson were waiting. They'd found something. "There's a campsite," Martinez said. pointing toward a clearing about 100 yards from the shore. Definitely used recently. We found the remains of a fire, some food wrappers, and this. He held up a small notebook, protected in a plastic evidence bag. I took the bag and examined the notebook. It was spiral-bound, the kind you could buy at any drugstore. The pages were damp but readable. I opened it carefully and started reading. The entries were dated. The first one was from 3 days ago. October 23rd. Arrived at Lake Crescent around noon. Found a good spot near the south shore. Beautiful place. Quiet. Exactly what I needed. The next entry was from 2 days ago. October 24th. Spent the day hiking. Saw a bald eagle and some deer. The water here is incredibly clear. You can see straight to the bottom near the shore. Makes me nervous, though. Something about how deep it gets just a few yards out, like the earth just drops away beneath you. And then yesterday's entry. October 25th, woke up around 3 a.m. Couldn't sleep. Felt like someone was watching me. Checked around the camp, but didn't see anyone. Tried to go back to sleep, but kept hearing sounds, like footsteps in the water. Wet, slapping sounds. But when I looked, there was nothing there. Later, about 9 p.m., I saw them, lights on the water. 5 of them, maybe more. They're just floating out there, glowing. They're beautiful, but they make me feel sick. Like I'm looking at something I shouldn't be seeing. I want to go out there. I don't know why, but I do. It's like they're calling to me. That was the last entry. The page after it was blank. I looked up at Sullivan. He saw them too, the same lights I saw. Sullivan took the notebook and read the entries himself, his expression growing darker with each line. When he finished, he handed it back to Martinez. Bag this as evidence. We need to expand the search. If Aaron Hollis went into the water last night, we need to find him. Captain, I said quietly, what if he's not in the water? What if he went somewhere else? Where else would he go? His camp is here, his pack was in the water, but his body isn't, and those lights, whatever they are, they went down, into the lake. What if he followed them? Sullivan stared at me. Clara, are you suggesting that a grown man dove into a glacial lake in the middle of the night to follow some lights? I'm saying we don't know what those lights do to people. Jennifer said the forest went quiet when they appeared. Aaron wrote that he felt like they were calling to him. What if they do something to your mind? What if they make you do things you wouldn't normally do? Martinez spoke up. She's got a point, Captain. People don't usually abandon their camps and all their gear for no reason. And if he went swimming, why leave his pack behind? Why not take it with him, or at least secure it? Sullivan was quiet for a moment, then nodded. All right, we'll proceed on the assumption that Aaron Hollis may have entered the water voluntarily, but in an altered state of mind. Reeves, call in the dive team. I want them here within the hour. Whitby, Martinez, you're going to interview every camper and fisherman in the area. Find out if anyone else saw the lights or noticed anything unusual last night. Yes, sir, we said in unison. We spent the rest of the morning talking to people. Most of them hadn't seen anything. They'd been asleep or hadn't been near the lake at the right time. But one man, a fisherman named Douglas, who'd been out on the water before dawn, had something interesting to say. I saw something strange, he told us, sitting in his truck with a thermos of coffee in his hands. Around 4:30 this morning, I was heading to my favorite fishing spot on the north end of the lake, and I saw something in the water. Thought it was a log at first, but then I got closer and realized it was a person, just floating there, face down. My heart stopped. Did you pull them out? I tried, got my boat right up next to them, reached out to grab them, but when I touched their shoulder, they just sank. Went straight down like they were weighted. I couldn't even see them after that. Water was too dark. Did you see what they looked like? Male or female? Male, I think. Hard to say for sure. They were wearing dark clothes, and I didn't get a good look at their face, but the build was definitely masculine. I exchanged a glance with Martinez. Did you report this? Of course. Called the ranger station right away. That's when they told me about the backpack and asked me to come back to the dock. I pulled it out on my way back in. Mr. Douglas, I need you to think carefully. When the person sank, did you notice anything else? Any lights? Any unusual sounds? Anything at all? He frowned, thinking. Now that you mention it, yeah. There was a glow, deep under the water, like someone had a flashlight down there. But it was faint, and it faded fast. Figured it was just the sun coming up, playing tricks with the water. But it was weird. After we finished with Douglas, Martinez and I reported back to Sullivan. The dive team had arrived, and they were preparing to go into the water near where Douglas had seen the body. If it's Aaron Hollis, we need to recover him, Sullivan said. But Clara, I want you to stay here and coordinate. I don't want you going back out on that water. Not after what you saw last night. Captain, I'm fine. That's an order, Ranger Whitby. You've been on duty for over 24 hours. You've had minimal sleep, and you've experienced something traumatic. I need you sharp, and right now, you're running on fumes. Take a break. Get some coffee, file your reports, and let the dive team do their job. I wanted to argue, but I knew he was right. I was exhausted, and my judgment was compromised. Yes, sir. I walked back to my truck and sat in the cab, watching the dive team prepare. They were professionals, trained for this kind of recovery. If Aaron Hollis was down there, they'd find him. But I couldn't shake the feeling that they wouldn't. That whatever had taken Aaron, whatever those lights were, wasn't going to give him back. The dive team went into the water just after noon. They stayed down for 40 minutes, then surfaced, and reported what I'd already suspected. They'd found nothing. No body, no clothing, no equipment. Just the cold, dark depths of Lake Crescent, and somewhere far below, where the sunlight couldn't reach, those pale lights were waiting. I didn't go home that night. Instead, I went to the ranger station and headed straight for the archives. If Sullivan was right about the historical reports, I needed to see them for myself. I needed to understand what we were dealing with. The archives were in the basement, a cramped room filled with metal filing cabinets and cardboard boxes that smelled like old paper and mildew. I found the section labeled Incident Reports, Historical, and started pulling files. It took me an hour of searching before I found what I was looking for. The file was thin, maybe 20 pages, and it was labeled Lake Crescent, Unexplained Phenomena. I sat down at the old wooden desk in the corner and started reading. The first report was from 1952. A fisherman named Harold Moss had reported seeing strange lights dancing on the water around midnight. He'd gone out in his boat to investigate and claimed the lights had circled him like they were curious. When he tried to get closer, they descended into the water and disappeared. 2 days later, a camper named Ruth Tolliver went missing. Her tent was found intact, her belongings untouched, but Ruth was never seen again. The next report was from 1967. A group of teenagers had been camping near the North Shore when they saw the lights. One of them, a boy named Michael Sanders, had waded into the water like he was in a trance, according to his friends. They'd pulled him back, and he'd snapped out of it, but he couldn't remember what had compelled him to walk into the lake. Michael was lucky. A month later, a solo hiker named Patricia Kellerman disappeared from the same area. Her pack was found floating near the shore. The pattern continued. 1973, 1981, 1989, 1996, 2004, 2011. Every few years, someone would report the lights, and every time, someone would disappear shortly after. Sometimes their bodies were recovered, sometimes they weren't. But they all had one thing in common. They'd been near Lake Crescent when the lights appeared. There was one report that caught my attention more than the others. It was from 1989, written by a ranger named Thomas Brightwater. His account was more detailed than the others, more personal. I've worked this park for 15 years, and I've never seen anything like this. The lights aren't natural. They move with purpose, with intelligence. I watched them for over an hour, and I swear they were watching me back. My partner, Ranger Elizabeth Morrison, went out on the water to investigate. She never came back. We found her boat the next morning, empty and drifting. No signs of struggle, no evidence of what happened to her. But I know it was the lights. They took her. The elders from the local tribes won't talk about the lights, but they're not surprised when I mention them. One of them, a man named Joseph Running Bear, told me that the lake has always been this way, that it's a doorway to somewhere else, and the lights are the guardians. He said the lake takes people sometimes, but only those who are called, only those who are meant to cross over. When I asked him what that meant, he wouldn't explain. He just said that some things are older than words, and we should respect them by staying away. I sat back in my chair, my mind racing. A doorway to somewhere else. Guardians, people who are called. The words echoed in my head, mixing with what I'd seen, what Aaron had written in his notebook. It's like they're calling to me. I needed to talk to someone who understood this, someone who knew the history, the legends, and I knew exactly where to start. The next morning, I drove to the Elwha Reservation, about an hour west of Lake Crescent. I'd worked with the tribal council before on various park issues, and they'd always been helpful, respectful, but I'd never asked them about this. I met with an elder named Margaret White Cloud. She was in her 70s with long gray hair braided down her back and eyes that seemed to see right through you. We sat in her small home, drinking tea while the rain drummed on the roof. "You're here about the lights," she said before I could even ask. It wasn't a question. "Yes, how did you know?" "Because people always come asking about them eventually, usually after someone goes missing." She sipped her tea, her expression sad. "How many this time?" "One that we know of. A man named Aaron Hollis. His pack was found in the water, but we haven't recovered his body." Margaret nodded slowly. "You won't. Not if the lights took him." "What are they?" I asked. "The lights, what are they really?" She was quiet for a long moment, her gaze distant. "My grandfather told me stories when I was a girl, stories about the time before the white settlers came, when our people lived in harmony with this land. The lake, what you call Lake Crescent, we called it spirit water. We knew it was sacred, but also dangerous. The lights have been there longer than anyone can remember. Some say they're the spirits of people who drowned in the lake centuries ago. Others say they're guardians, protecting something beneath the water, something that shouldn't be disturbed." "A doorway," I said, remembering Thomas Brightwater's report. "One of the old rangers wrote that the lake is a doorway to somewhere else." Margaret's eyes sharpened. "You've been reading the archives?" "Yes, and I saw the lights myself 2 nights ago. One of them came right at me. There was something inside it, a shadow. Almost human, but not quite." She set down her teacup and leaned forward. "Then you've seen more than most. The lights show themselves to very few people. Usually only to those they intend to take." A chill ran through me. Why didn't they take me? I don't know. Maybe you weren't called. Maybe you were strong enough to resist. Or maybe they're still deciding. She paused, studying my face. The lights are drawn to certain people, those who are lost, troubled, seeking something. They sense desperation, loneliness, pain, and they offer an escape. An escape to where? No one knows for certain. Some say it's another world, a place between life and death. Others say it's oblivion, that the lights consume you and leave nothing behind. But everyone agrees on one thing. Once you follow them into the water, you don't come back. I thought about Aaron Hollis, about the photo in his wallet, the woman and the boy smiling. Aaron had a family, a wife and son. Why would he follow the lights if he had so much to live for? Depression doesn't care what you have, Margaret said gently. Neither does despair. The lights find the cracks in people's armor, the places where they're vulnerable, and they exploit them. Your Aaron, he may have looked fine on the surface, but inside he was struggling. The lights saw that, they always do. I sat with that information for a moment, feeling the weight of it. Is there any way to stop them? To prevent them from taking people? Margaret shook her head. My people learned long ago not to fight the lake. We respect it, we honor it, and we stay away when the lights appear. That's the only protection we have. You can't stop the lights, Ranger Whitby. You can only warn people to stay away from them. But people won't listen. They'll be curious. They'll want to investigate. Then they'll be taken. That's the way it's always been. The lake will have its due. I left Margaret's home feeling hollowed out. Everything she'd said made a terrible kind of sense. Aaron Hollis hadn't been dragged into the water. He'd gone willingly, called by something he couldn't resist. And I'd almost followed them too, that night on the boat. If that light had stayed near me for just a few more seconds, if I'd stared into it any longer, would I have jumped in? Would I have given myself over to whatever waited beneath the surface? When I got back to the ranger station, Sullivan called me into his office. His expression was grim. Seattle PD reached Aaron Hollis's wife. She confirmed he'd been struggling with depression for the past year, lost his job, had some health issues, was seeing a therapist. She thought the camping trip would help him clear his head, give him some time alone to think. Did she know he was camping at Lake Crescent specifically? No, he just told her he was going to Olympic National Park. Could have been anywhere. Sullivan leaned back in his chair. The dive team did another sweep this morning. Still nothing. At this point, we have to assume Aaron Hollis is deceased. We'll file the report, notify the family, and close the case as an accidental drowning. But it wasn't an accident, I said. He saw the lights. They called to him, and he followed them. Clara, we can't put that in an official report. We have no evidence that the lights caused his death. All we have is a missing person, a backpack in the water, and witness testimony about unexplained phenomena. That's not enough to conclude anything except that a man drowned in a lake. So we just let it happen again. We wait for the next person to see the lights and disappear. Sullivan's jaw tightened. What do you want me to do? Close the lake? Station rangers on every shoreline every night. We don't have the resources, and we don't have the authority. The best we can do is what we've always done. Warn people to be careful, to stay on marked trails, to camp in designated areas, and hope they listen. I knew he was right, but it didn't make me feel any better. What about the archives, all those old reports? We should compile them, create a database, at least document the pattern so future rangers know what they're dealing with. I'll assign someone to it. But Clara, I need you to let this go. You did your job. You investigated, you searched, you documented everything. Aaron Hollis made his choice, whether he was in his right mind or not. You can't save everyone. I know, I said quietly. But I can try. 3 weeks passed. Life at the ranger station returned to normal, or as normal as it could be. The rain continued, the tourists thinned out as winter approached, and I went back to my regular patrols. But I couldn't stop thinking about Lake Crescent, about the lights, about Aaron Hollis walking into the water and never coming back. I started keeping my own log. Every time I heard a report of unusual activity near the lake, strange sounds, unexplained lights, people feeling compelled to approach the water, I documented it. The pattern Margaret had described was there. The lights appeared most often during the new moon, when the nights were darkest, and they seemed to target people who were alone, vulnerable, struggling with something. I also started visiting the lake at night, parking at a distance and watching the water through binoculars. I told myself I was just being vigilant, making sure no one else went missing. But the truth was, part of me wanted to see the lights again, wanted to understand them. It was during one of these late-night vigils that I saw them return. It was a Thursday in mid-November, cold and clear, with a sliver of moon barely visible through the clouds. I was parked at an overlook about half a mile from the south shore, my binoculars trained on the water. At first, there was nothing, just the dark expanse of the lake, reflecting the faint light of the stars. And then, around midnight, they appeared. 5 pale lights, glowing softly just above the surface of the water. They drifted slowly, aimlessly, like they were waiting for something, or someone. I grabbed my radio, ready to call it in. But then I hesitated. What would I say? That the lights were back? That we needed to evacuate the campgrounds? Sullivan would think I was obsessed, that I couldn't let it go. And he'd be right. Instead, I watched. I watched as the lights moved across the water, their glow reflecting faintly on the surface. I watched as they clustered together, then spread apart like they were searching. And I watched as, one by one, they began to descend into the depths of the lake, their light fading until there was nothing left but darkness. They hadn't taken anyone tonight, but they'd been looking. As I drove home, I thought about what Margaret had said. You can't stop the lights. You can only warn people to stay away from them. It was true. I couldn't fight something I didn't understand, couldn't save people from something they couldn't see until it was too late. But I could bear witness, I could document, investigate, and warn. I could make sure that when the next person saw the lights, there would be someone who believed them, someone who understood, because the lights weren't going away. They'd been here long before the park was established, long before any of us arrived, and they'd be here long after we were gone. That was the truth of Lake Crescent. That was the price of its beauty. The lake was sacred, the lake was dangerous, and the lake would always take its due. I never found out what happened to Aaron Hollis. His body was never recovered, and his case remains officially listed as an accidental drowning. His wife and son held a memorial service, and life moved on the way it always does. But I still think about him sometimes, about that last night when he sat by his campfire and wrote in his notebook. They're beautiful, but they make me feel sick, like I'm looking at something I shouldn't be seeing. He knew something was wrong, he felt it, but he followed them anyway. Maybe the lights really do offer an escape. Maybe there is something beneath the water, some doorway to another place where pain and despair don't exist. Or maybe they're just predators, ancient and patient, waiting for the next vulnerable soul to wander too close. I don't know. And I probably never will. All I know is that I keep watching. I keep documenting. And when I see those pale lights drifting across the water, I feel the same pull Aaron must have felt, the same terrible curiosity, the same desire to understand. But I don't follow them. I turn around and I walk away. Because some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. Some doors are better left unopened, and Lake Crescent keeps its secrets close, down in the cold, dark depths where the light never reaches, where the pale lights wait, patient and eternal, for the next person to hear their call. The Pacific Ocean doesn't forgive mistakes. That's the first thing they teach you when you start working the coastal section of Olympic National Park. The second thing is that the rules exist for a reason, and when people break them, bad things happen. I've been a ranger on this stretch of coastline for 9 years, and I've seen enough accidents, enough close calls, enough bodies pulled from the surf to know that the ocean is patient. It waits for you to get careless, to underestimate it, and then it takes what it wants. My name is Nolan Mercer, and I work the loneliest beat in the Park Service. 73 miles of rugged coastline, most of it accessible only by foot or boat. Rocky beaches, towering sea stacks, and waves that can reach 20 feet during storm season. It's beautiful in a raw, untamed way that makes your chest tight when you stand on the cliffs and watch the sun set over the water. But it's also deadly. The currents here are brutal, the rocks slippery with algae, and the fog can roll in so thick you can't see your hand in front of your face. People don't understand that when they come here. They see the beauty, the wildness, and they think they can conquer it. They ignore the warning signs, the closure notices, the bright red tape we string across trails that lead to dangerous areas. And then they disappear, and we're the ones who have to find them, or what's left of them. It was early November when I got the call about Ivy Monroe. I was finishing my morning patrol, walking the beach near Rialto with my radio crackling static and my boots leaving prints in the wet sand. The sky was gray and heavy, threatening rain, and the wind coming off the ocean carried the smell of salt and seaweed. I'd been checking on a family of harbor seals that had hauled out on the rocks near Hole in the Wall when my radio came to life. "Mercer, this is Base. We've got a report of an abandoned camp on Second Beach. Tents still set up, but no sign of the occupant. Can you head over there and check it out?" I keyed the mic. "Copy that. What's the reporting party's information?" "Hiker found it about 20 minutes ago. Said the tent's been there for at least a day based on the condition. There's personal belongings inside, including a wallet with ID. Name's Ivy Monroe, 23, from Portland. Hiker also said they found a surfboard in the water nearby." My stomach tightened. Second Beach was technically open to camping, but there were sections of it that we'd closed off due to dangerous conditions. High surf, unstable cliffs, and unpredictable currents made certain areas too risky for overnight stays. If Ivy Monroe had camped in one of those zones, if she'd gone into the water alone— "I'm about 45 minutes out," I said. "Tell the reporting party to stay at the campsite and don't touch anything. I'll be there as soon as I can." "Copy that. Be safe, Mercer." I started jogging back toward my truck, my mind already running through the possibilities. An abandoned tent could mean a lot of things. Maybe Ivy had gone for a morning surf and hadn't come back yet. Maybe she'd hiked to a different beach and lost track of time. Or maybe she'd gone into the water and the ocean had taken her. That surfboard in the water was a bad sign. Surfers don't abandon their boards. Those things are expensive, and more importantly, they're lifelines. If her board was floating free, something had gone wrong. The drive to Second Beach took 30 minutes, winding through dense coastal forest on roads that were barely more than gravel paths. The trees here were different from the rainforest inland. Stunted by the salt wind, twisted into strange shapes, their branches draped with moss that hung like gray hair. The fog was starting to roll in, thick tendrils of white that snaked between the trunks and made visibility spotty. When I reached the trailhead, I grabbed my emergency kit and headed down the path to the beach. Second Beach was one of the more accessible spots on this stretch of coast, but it was still a quarter-mile hike through the forest to reach the sand. The trail was muddy from recent rain, and I could see fresh footprints, the hiker who'd called it in, probably, along with what looked like older prints from someone wearing smaller shoes. Ivy's, most likely. The beach opened up before me, a wide crescent of dark sand hemmed in by towering sea stacks and rocky outcroppings. The surf was heavy today, waves crashing against the rocks with enough force to send spray 20 feet into the air. A handful of people were scattered along the beach. Tourists, photographers, the usual crowd, but I could see the tent immediately. It was set up near the tree line, about 50 yards from the water, right at the edge of the zone we'd designated as unsafe, of course. I approached the tent and found the hiker who'd called it in waiting nearby. He was in his 50s, wearing expensive gear that looked like it had never seen actual use. His face was pale, and he kept glancing nervously at the water. "You the ranger?" he asked as I walked up. "Yeah, Nolan Mercer? You're the one who found the tent?" He nodded quickly. "I was just walking the beach, taking some photos, and I saw it sitting here. Thought it was weird that someone would camp so close to the water, especially with the surf like this. So I came over to check, make sure everything was okay, and..." He gestured helplessly at the tent. "Nobody's here, but all their stuff is. Wallet, phone, clothes, and the shoes are right there." He pointed at the tent entrance. I looked where he was pointing and felt my chest tighten. A pair of worn sneakers sat just outside the tent flap, positioned neatly side by side like someone had just stepped out of them. That detail bothered me more than anything else. People don't usually take off their shoes and then walk away from their campsite. Not on a beach like this, where the sand was cold and the rocks were sharp. "Did you touch anything?" I asked. "No. Well, I looked inside the tent, but I didn't move anything. Her wallet was on top of her sleeping bag. That's how I got her name." "Good. I need you to head back up to the parking area and wait there. Give your contact information to any other rangers who show up. We're going to need a full statement." He nodded and hurried off, clearly relieved to be dismissed. I waited until he was out of sight, then pulled on a pair of latex gloves and crouched down in front of the tent. The sneakers were women's size 7, well worn, with sand crusted in the treads. They were damp but not soaked, which meant they'd been here for at least a few hours, but probably not overnight. I made a note of that and then carefully opened the tent flap. Inside was exactly what you'd expect from a solo camper: a sleeping bag, a backpack, a small camp stove, and some food supplies. Everything was organized, not scattered or disturbed. The wallet was where the hiker had said it would be, sitting on top of the sleeping bag. I opened it carefully and found Ivy Monroe's driver's license, along with some cash, a credit card, and a photo of her with a group of friends, all of them grinning at the camera. Ivy was young, with sun-bleached hair and the kind of tan that came from spending days in the water. She looked happy in the photo, carefree. I wondered what had brought her here, to this isolated stretch of coastline, camping alone in a place that was barely safe even for experienced outdoor enthusiasts. I continued searching the tent and found her phone, dead and uncharged, tucked into a side pocket of her backpack. There was a notebook, too, the kind surfers use to log conditions and sessions. I flipped through it carefully. The last entry was from yesterday morning. November 7th. Arrived at Second Beach around 4 p.m. Set up camp near the tree line. Surf looks good. Clean sets, maybe 6 to 8 feet. We'll check it out at sunrise. This place is perfect. Exactly what I needed. That was it. No mention of plans to go anywhere else, no indication that she was meeting anyone. Just a surfer looking for good waves and some solitude. I zipped the tent back up and stood, scanning the beach. The surfboard the hiker had mentioned. Where was it? I walked toward the water, my boots sinking into the wet sand. The tide was coming in, which meant the high water mark was moving higher up the beach. In a few hours, the spot where Ivy's tent sat would be underwater. That was another problem. If she'd gone into the water early this morning, if she'd gotten into trouble, the tide would have already erased any evidence. Footprints, signs of struggle, anything that might tell me what had happened. It would all be gone, washed away by the relentless cycle of the Pacific. I spotted the surfboard about 30 yards down the beach, caught in a tangle of driftwood and kelp. I jogged over and pulled it free. It was a longboard, maybe 9 feet, with a few dings in the fiberglass but nothing that suggested recent damage. The leash was still attached, but it had been snapped. Not cut, snapped, like something had pulled on it hard enough to break it. I examined the break. The leash was thick urethane, designed to withstand a lot of force. For it to snap like this, Ivy would have had to hit the water hard, maybe tumbled by a big wave, or pulled under by a strong current. Or she'd released it herself, which surfers sometimes did in extreme situations to avoid being dragged down by their board. Either way, this was bad. If Ivy had been in the water long enough for her board to wash up here, if she'd lost her leash in rough surf, the chances of finding her alive were dropping fast. The water temperature this time of year was maybe 50 degrees. Hypothermia would set in within minutes, and even if she was a strong swimmer, even if she knew what to do, the currents could carry her miles down the coast. I keyed my radio. "Base, this is Mercer. I'm at the campsite. Found the tent and belongings. Subject's shoes are at the tent entrance, and I've recovered her surfboard with a broken leash. No sign of the subject. I'm calling this a water rescue. Need Coast Guard assistance and a search team. Also, we need to check tide tables and current patterns. If she went in this morning, we need to figure out where she might have drifted." "Copy that, Mercer. Coast Guard's already been notified. They're sending a helicopter and a boat. ETA 30 minutes. Search team is assembling. Captain Sullivan wants you to secure the area and start a preliminary beach search." Understood. I spent the next 20 minutes walking the beach, scanning the surf, the rocks, the tide pools. I was looking for anything, a wetsuit, a piece of clothing, any sign that Ivy had been here. But the beach was clean. The waves had erased everything. By the time the Coast Guard helicopter arrived, the fog had thickened, and visibility was down to maybe 100 yards. I watched the helicopter circle overhead, its searchlight cutting through the gray, and I knew they weren't going to find anything. Not from the air, not in these conditions. Captain Sullivan arrived with the search team about 20 minutes later. He was a veteran ranger, mid-50s, with the kind of weathered face that came from decades of working outdoors. He'd seen enough missing persons cases to know the odds, and his expression told me he wasn't optimistic. "Talk to me, Mercer," he said, walking up to where I stood near the tent. I gave him the rundown, the abandoned camp, the shoes, the surfboard with the broken leash. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, looking out at the water. "Tide came in around 5 this morning," he said. "If she went surfing at first light, like her notebook says she was planning to, that would put her in the water around 6:30, 7 o'clock. That's 8 hours ago. If she got into trouble, if she went under—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. "We need to search the coastline," I said. "North and south. The current runs south this time of year, so if she drifted, that's where she'd end up. But we should also check the rocks and tide pools. Sometimes bodies get caught in—" "I know," Sullivan interrupted. "I've already got teams heading both directions. Coast Guard's doing a water search, and we've got a boat checking the offshore areas. But Mercer, you know as well as I do that the odds aren't good. This time of year, this stretch of coast, if she's been in the water for 8 hours, she's gone," I finished quietly. Sullivan nodded. "Yeah, but we do the search anyway. We owe her that. and we owe her family answers. The search went on for hours. We walked miles of coastline, climbed over slippery rocks, checked every cave and crevice where a body might have washed up. The Coast Guard helicopter made pass after pass, and the boat crew searched the waters offshore. But we found nothing. No wetsuit, no body, no sign that Ivy Monroe had ever been here except for that tent, those shoes, and that surfboard with its snapped leash. As the day wore on and the light began to fade, Sullivan called off the active search. "We'd resume in the morning," he said, "with fresh eyes and better weather." But I could see in his face that he didn't expect to find anything. The ocean had taken Ivy Monroe, and it wasn't giving her back. I was the last one to leave the beach. I stood there in the gathering darkness, watching the waves roll in, and I thought about those shoes sitting neatly at the tent entrance, about how carefully they'd been placed, like Ivy had fully intended to come back and put them on again, about how she'd written in her notebook that this place was perfect, exactly what she needed. And I wondered what she'd needed so badly that she'd come to this isolated, dangerous stretch of coastline alone. What she'd been running from, or running toward. Whether she'd found it in those cold, dark waters. The fog rolled in thick that night, swallowing the beach and the forest and everything in between. And somewhere out there, beyond the surf and the rocks and the reach of our searchlights, Ivy Monroe was gone. I didn't sleep that night. I kept seeing those shoes, kept thinking about the broken leash, kept running through scenarios in my head. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Ivy Monroe's face from that photo, young, smiling, alive. And every time I opened them, I remembered that she was probably dead, somewhere at the bottom of the Pacific or washed up on some remote stretch of beach we hadn't searched yet. At dawn, I was back at Second Beach with a fresh search team. The fog had lifted slightly, enough to see maybe 200 yards in any direction, but the sky remained overcast and threatening. The tent was still there, now surrounded by yellow caution tape, and the tide had come and gone twice since yesterday, erasing any remaining traces of Ivy's presence on the beach. Sullivan had assembled a larger team this time, 10 rangers, plus a Coast Guard contingent and a K-9 unit from the county sheriff's office. The dog, a German shepherd named Atlas, was trained for cadaver recovery. Nobody said it out loud, but we all knew what that meant. We weren't searching for a survivor anymore. We were searching for a body. I was paired with a younger ranger named Keller for the morning sweep. He was relatively new to the coastal section, maybe 2 years on the job, and he had the kind of nervous energy that came from not having done many recovery operations. I remembered being like that once, before the job wore down your edges and taught you to compartmentalize. "Where do you want to start?" Keller asked as we stood near the waterline, watching the waves roll in. "North," I said. "The current runs south, but sometimes bodies get caught in the rocks and pushed back north by the tide. We'll work our way up the coast, check every tide pool, every cave, every place where something could wash up." We started walking, our boots crunching on the mixture of sand and broken shells. The beach here was rough, not the smooth, sandy stretches you see in postcards, but a chaotic jumble of driftwood, kelp, and stone. Every few yards, we'd stop and search, moving aside piles of seaweed, checking behind rocks, looking for anything that didn't belong. We'd been at it for maybe an hour when Keller called out, "Mercer, over here!" I jogged over to where he was standing near a cluster of barnacle-covered rocks. He was pointing at something in a shallow tide pool. I crouched down and saw it immediately, a wetsuit glove, black neoprene, caught between 2 rocks. I pulled it out carefully, water streaming from it. "It's fresh," Keller said. "No algae growth, no deterioration. This hasn't been here long." He was right. I turned the glove over in my hands, examining it. It was a women's size medium, with a Velcro strap at the wrist. The strap was still fastened, which meant it hadn't been pulled off by force. Someone had removed it intentionally. "Bag it," I said, handing it to Keller. "Mark the location. This might be hers." We continued searching and found the matching glove about 20 yards further north, caught in a tangle of kelp. Both gloves, but no wetsuit, no booties, no other gear. It was strange. If Ivy had taken off her gloves while in the water, where was the rest of her equipment? I radioed Sullivan. "Captain, we've got 2 wetsuit gloves, recovered about a quarter-mile north of the campsite. Both appear recent, no sign of other equipment." "Copy that. Keep searching. Coast Guard's doing another aerial sweep, and the K9 unit is working the tree line." Keller and I pushed further north, climbing over slippery rocks and navigating through narrow passages between sea stacks. The coast here was more rugged, less accessible, and it was easy to see how someone could get into trouble. One slip, one moment of lost footing, and you'd be in the water with no easy way back out. We found the wetsuit around noon. It was wedged into a crevice between 2 large boulders, about 30 feet above the current water line. The rock formation created a kind of natural alcove, and the wetsuit had been pushed there by the waves during high tide. Keller spotted it first, a flash of black neoprene against the gray stone. "That's it," I said, scrambling up the rocks to reach it. "That's her wetsuit." I pulled it free carefully, checking for damage. It was a full suit, long-sleeved and footed, designed for cold water. The zipper was still pulled up, which meant Ivy had been wearing it when she entered the water. But here's what bothered me. There were no tears, no significant damage, nothing to suggest she'd been tumbled by waves or scraped against rocks. It was wet, but intact. "How does a wetsuit come off?" Keller asked, climbing up beside me. "I mean, you can't just slip out of one of these, right? They're tight." "Right," I said slowly. "You have to unzip it and pull it off. Takes effort, especially when it's wet." We stared at each other, both of us realizing what that meant. Ivy hadn't been thrown from her wetsuit by the waves. She'd taken it off herself. But why would she do that? Why would a surfer in 50-degree water deliberately remove the one thing keeping her from hypothermia? I keyed my radio. "Sullivan, we've got the wetsuit. It's intact, zippers up, no damage." She removed it herself. There was a long pause before Sullivan responded. "Say again, Mercer. You're saying she took off her wetsuit while in the water?" "That's what it looks like. The gloves, too. She removed all her gear deliberately." Another pause. "That doesn't make sense unless—" He trailed off, but I knew what he was thinking. Cold water confusion. Hypothermia can do strange things to your mind. In the later stages, people sometimes start removing their clothes, convinced they're overheating even as their body temperature drops to dangerous levels. It's called paradoxical undressing, and it's a sign that the person is close to death. But Ivy was an experienced surfer. She would have known the signs of hypothermia. She would have known to get out of the water, to get warm. Unless something else had been wrong. Unless she'd been disoriented or injured. "We need to expand the search," I said. "If she removed her wetsuit, she couldn't have lasted long. She would have succumbed to hypothermia within minutes. The body has to be close." "Agreed. Bring the wetsuit back to base. We'll document it and send it to the lab, see if there's anything we're missing." Keller and I bagged the wetsuit and started making our way back to Second Beach. As we walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The carefully placed shoes, the broken leash, the removed wetsuit, each piece of evidence told a story. But I couldn't figure out what that story was. When we got back to base camp, the K9 unit was already there, the handler looking grim. Atlas, the German shepherd, was sitting at attention, and I could see the tension in his posture. He'd found something. "What have you got?" Sullivan asked, walking over. The handler, a woman named Garcia, shook her head. Atlas alerted about 100 yards into the tree line, near a game trail. But there's nothing there. No body, no remains. He's trained to alert on human decomposition, and he was showing all the signs, whining, pawing at the ground, getting agitated. But we dug down a few inches and found nothing. I've never seen him false alert before. Sullivan frowned. Could there be something buried deeper? Maybe. Or maybe something was there recently and was moved. Atlas can detect scent residue for days after the source is gone. But here's the weird thing, he alerted at multiple spots. 5 different locations, all within a 100-yard radius, like whatever he's detecting was dragged around. A chill ran through me. Dragged around? By what? Garcia shrugged. Could be an animal. Bear, cougar, something that found the body and moved it, or... She hesitated. Or what? Sullivan pressed. Or someone moved it. But that doesn't make sense either, because why would anyone do that, and who? We stood there in silence, all of us thinking the same thing. This wasn't adding up. The evidence was contradicting itself. On one hand, we had all the signs of a drowning. The surfboard, the broken leash, the abandoned camp. But on the other hand, we had removed gear, a cadaver dog alerting in the forest, and no body. I want the entire area cordoned off, Sullivan said finally. Treat this as a potential crime scene. Get forensics out here, and I want every inch of that tree line searched. If there's a body, we find it. If there's evidence of foul play, we document it. This isn't a simple drowning anymore. The afternoon brought more questions than answers. The forensics team arrived and began processing the tree line where Atlas had alerted. They took soil samples, photographed the area, and used ground-penetrating radar to check for buried remains. But they found nothing conclusive. Just some disturbed earth and what might have been drag marks, but they were too degraded to tell for certain. Meanwhile, I went back to Ivy's tent with a more critical eye. If this wasn't a drowning, if something else had happened, there might be clues I'd missed. I searched through her belongings again, this time looking for anything unusual. I found it in the side pocket of her backpack. A small journal, different from the surf log I'd seen yesterday. This one was personal, filled with handwritten entries dating back several months. I sat down on a piece of driftwood and started reading. The early entries were mundane. Notes about work, friends, relationships. But as I read further, the tone changed. Ivy had been struggling. Her job was stressing her out. She'd broken up with a long-term boyfriend and she was feeling lost, disconnected. The entries became darker, more introspective. One entry from 3 weeks ago caught my attention. I need to get away. I need to find somewhere quiet. Somewhere I can think. Everyone keeps telling me I need to talk to someone, see a therapist, take medication, but I don't need that. I just need space. I need to prove to myself that I can handle this alone, that I'm strong enough. And then, from 5 days ago, I've decided I'm going to Olympic. The coast there is supposed to be incredible for surfing, and it's isolated enough that I won't have to deal with crowds. Just me and the ocean. That's all I need. That's where I'll find my answer. I felt my chest tighten. The journal painted a picture of someone who was struggling emotionally, someone who'd come to this isolated stretch of coastline looking for something. Peace, maybe, or escape. But escape from what? Her problems? Her life? The last entry was from the night she arrived. I'm here, Second Beach. It's perfect, exactly as isolated as I hoped. No cell service, no distractions. Just the sound of the waves and the forest. Tomorrow, I'll surf at dawn. I'll push myself, test my limits, and maybe I'll finally understand what I'm supposed to do. Maybe the ocean will tell me. I read that line again. Maybe the ocean will tell me. What did that mean? Was it just poetic language, or was it something more? Had Ivy come here planning to do something drastic? I radioed Sullivan. "Captain, I found a personal journal in her belongings. I think we need to consider the possibility that this wasn't an accident." "What are you saying, Mercer?" I chose my words carefully. "I'm saying Ivy Monroe was dealing with some serious emotional issues. She came here deliberately to an isolated location, looking for answers. And based on her journal entries, I think she might have been testing herself, pushing her limits. You think this was a suicide? I think it's a possibility we can't ignore. But Captain, even if that's what this was, it still doesn't explain everything. The removed wetsuit, the dog alerts in the forest, the way evidence is scattered over a wide area. Something doesn't fit." Sullivan was quiet for a moment. "Bring me the journal. We'll need to share this with the family, and we'll need to adjust our search parameters. If she went into the water deliberately, she might have swum out further than we thought. She might be miles down the coast by now." I packed up the journal and was about to head back to base camp when something caught my eye. Movement. Up in the tree line, maybe 50 yards from where I stood. I froze, watching. At first, I thought it might be a deer or a raccoon, but then I saw it again. A shape, dark and hunched, moving between the trees. "Hello," I called out. "This is Ranger Mercer. If someone's up there, you need to identify yourself. This is a restricted area." No response. The shape moved again, deeper into the forest, and then disappeared. I grabbed my radio. "Sullivan, I've got possible movement in the tree line near the tent site. Requesting backup. On my way." I started moving toward where I'd seen the shape, my hand on the pepper spray at my belt. The forest was thick here, the trees close together, their branches forming a canopy that blocked most of the light. The ground was covered in ferns and fallen logs, and every step made noise, snapping twigs, rustling leaves. I'd gone maybe 30 yards when I found the first marker. It was a piece of yellow caution tape tied around a tree trunk. But this wasn't our tape. Ours was still down at the beach, surrounding Ivy's tent. This was different, older, faded, like it had been here for a while. I followed the markers deeper into the forest, finding them every 10 or 15 yards. They created a trail, leading away from the beach and toward the interior. My instincts were screaming at me to wait for backup, but I kept going, drawn forward by a growing sense of unease. The trail ended at a small clearing, and in the center of that clearing I found something that made my blood run cold. It was a campsite, but not a recent one. This site was old, abandoned, the tent collapsed and rotting, the gear scattered and weathered. And standing in the middle of it all, nailed to a tree, was a surfboard. It was broken in half, the fiberglass shattered, and carved into the wood was a message. "The ocean doesn't give back what it takes." I stood there, staring at that message, and I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. This wasn't Ivy's campsite. This was someone else's. Someone who'd been here before her. Someone who'd left a warning. Sullivan burst into the clearing behind me, breathing hard. "Mercer, what the hell?" He stopped when he saw the campsite, saw the broken surfboard with its carved message. "Captain," I said quietly, "I think we need to check the missing persons records. I think Ivy Monroe wasn't the first person to disappear from this beach." Sullivan and I stood in that abandoned campsite for a long moment, neither of us speaking. The broken surfboard with its carved warning seemed to dominate the clearing, drawing our eyes back to it again and again. The words had been cut deep into the fiberglass, deliberate and angry. "The ocean doesn't give back what it takes." "We need to process this scene," Sullivan said finally, his voice tight. Get forensics up here, photograph everything, bag any evidence we can find. And Mercer, I want you to pull every missing persons report from this section of coastline for the last 20 years. You think there are more? I asked, though I already knew the answer. I think we've been attributing drownings and disappearances to accidents and natural causes when maybe we should have been looking harder. This campsite, whoever was here, they left that message for a reason. They knew something. I nodded and pulled out my radio, calling in the forensics team. While we waited for them to arrive, Sullivan and I carefully walked the perimeter of the abandoned camp, looking for anything that might tell us who it had belonged to or when they'd been here. The tent was beyond salvage, the fabric rotted and torn, but the frame was still partially intact. It was a 2-person dome tent, the kind you could buy at any outdoor store. Near the collapsed entrance, I found a water bottle so covered in moss and dirt it was barely recognizable. Sullivan found a camp stove, rusted and non-functional, half buried in the undergrowth. But it was what I found under a fallen log that changed everything. A boot, a single hiking boot, women's size 8, with the laces still tied. The leather was deteriorated, cracked, and stiff from years of exposure, but you could still make out the brand name embossed on the side. Merrill. I picked it up carefully, turning it over in my hands. "Captain," I called out, "got something." Sullivan came over and examined the boot. His expression grew darker as he looked at it. "That's been here for years, at least 5, maybe more. Whoever left this campsite, they didn't take all their gear with them." "Or they couldn't," I said quietly. We both knew what that meant. You don't leave your boots behind, not when you're hiking out of a remote location, not unless something prevented you from taking them, not unless you never made it out at all. The forensics team arrived about 20 minutes later, along with 2 additional rangers. They set up a perimeter around the old campsite and began the painstaking process of documentation. Every item was photographed, measured, cataloged. The boot I'd found was bagged as evidence, along with the water bottle, pieces of the tent, and samples of the rotted rope that had been used to secure the tent stakes. While they worked, Sullivan and I hiked back to the ranger station, which was about 5 miles down the coast. The drive would have been faster, but we needed time to think, to process what we'd found. The trail wound through dense forest, occasionally opening up to views of the ocean crashing against the rocks below. "How many people go missing on this stretch every year?" I asked as we walked. Sullivan was quiet for a moment. "Officially, maybe 1 or 2, but that's just the ones we know about. The ones where family reported them missing, where we launched searches. There are others. People who came here alone, who didn't tell anyone where they were going. People who just vanished and nobody noticed because nobody was looking." Like Ivy, he agreed. If her friend in Portland hadn't called us, if that hiker hadn't found her tent, we might never have known she was here. She could have become another statistic, another person who drowned at Olympic and whose body was never recovered. We reached the station around 3 in the afternoon. Sullivan went straight to his office to start pulling records, while I grabbed a cup of coffee and sat down at my computer. I had a database of missing persons reports, organized by date and location. I started with the most recent and worked backward. It didn't take long to find the pattern. The first case that matched was from 2019. A solo hiker named Marcus Torres, age 31, had gone missing near 3rd Beach, just 2 miles south of 2nd Beach. His car was found at the trailhead, his tent was found abandoned on the beach, but Marcus was never seen again. The official report listed it as a presumed drowning, though his body was never recovered. Before that was 2016. Sarah Keller, 26, a photographer who'd come to shoot the coastline. Her camera was found on the rocks near Hole in the Wall. her tripod still set up. But Sarah was gone, presumed drowning. No body recovered. James Winters, 34, a surf instructor from California, found his wetsuit washed up on the shore near Rialto Beach, his board floating offshore. No body recovered. The list went on, 2010, 2007, 2004, going back nearly 20 years. All of them solo visitors. All of them experienced outdoors people who should have known better. All of them disappeared from this same stretch of coastline. All of them presumed drowned. None of their bodies ever recovered. And here's what really bothered me. In almost every case, their gear was found but arranged strangely. Shoes left behind, wetsuits removed, personal items left in tents, like they'd stepped out of their lives and walked away, leaving everything behind. I printed out the reports and brought them to Sullivan's office. He was on the phone, but he waved me in. I spread the printouts across his desk, and when he hung up, I walked him through what I'd found. 15 cases, I said. 15 people over 20 years, all disappeared from this same 10-mile stretch of coastline. All solo visitors, all experienced hikers or surfers or outdoor enthusiasts. And all of them left behind gear in ways that don't make sense. Sullivan picked up one of the reports, reading through it carefully. Why didn't we see this pattern before? Because they were spread out over 2 decades, and each one was investigated as an individual incident. We looked at them as isolated accidents, not as part of a larger pattern. And because the coastline is dangerous, people do drown here. People do make mistakes. It was easy to write them off. But now we have the abandoned campsite with the message, Sullivan said. And that changes things. Someone knew something was wrong. Someone tried to warn us. We need to identify who that campsite belonged to, I said. And we need to figure out what they knew. Sullivan nodded and picked up his phone again. I'm calling the state police. This is bigger than us. If there's a pattern, if there's something systematic happening on this coastline, we need resources we don't have. While Sullivan made calls, I went back to my computer and started cross-referencing the missing persons with any unusual activity in the area. Weather patterns, tide data, reports of suspicious people or vehicles. I was looking for anything that might connect the disappearances, any common thread besides the location. And I found it. Every single disappearance had occurred during a new moon. Not the day of the new moon specifically, but within 2 or 3 days of it. When the nights were darkest, when the tides were most extreme, when the ocean was at its most powerful and unpredictable. I brought this information to Sullivan, and he stared at the chart I'd created, his expression troubled. What are you suggesting? That something comes out of the ocean during the new moon and takes people? I'm not suggesting anything supernatural, I said quickly, but the new moon creates the highest tides, the strongest currents. Maybe that's when the ocean is most dangerous here. Maybe there's a rip current that forms, or some other natural phenomenon that we haven't documented. Or maybe whoever's doing this knows that's when they're least likely to be seen, Sullivan said quietly. The words hung in the air between us. Whoever's doing this. Up until that moment, we'd been dancing around the possibility, afraid to say it out loud. But now it was there, undeniable. What if these weren't accidents? What if someone was targeting solo visitors, luring them or taking them, and making it look like drownings? The state police arrived 2 hours later, along with a detective named Morrison who specialized in missing persons cases. She was in her 40s, with sharp eyes and an air of competence that immediately put me at ease. Sullivan briefed her on everything we'd found, and she listened without interrupting, taking notes in a small notebook. When he finished, she looked at the map we'd marked with all the disappearances. Have you found any witnesses? Anyone who saw these people before they disappeared? We're checking, Sullivan said. But this coastline is remote. During off-season, you might go days without seeing another person. If someone wanted to operate here without being noticed, this would be the perfect place." Morrison nodded. "I'm going to need access to all your records, all your case files. I want to go through them with fresh eyes, see if there's anything that was missed. And I want to interview every ranger who worked here during the time frame of these disappearances. Someone might have seen something, even if they didn't realize it was important at the time." "Whatever you need," Sullivan said. Over the next 2 days, the investigation expanded. More state police arrived, along with FBI agents who specialized in serial crimes. The old campsite in the forest was excavated, and forensics found something that confirmed our worst fears: traces of human remains in the soil. Not enough to identify who they belonged to, but enough to prove that someone had died there. The boot I'd found was sent to a lab for analysis, and they were able to extract DNA from the leather. It matched a woman named Rebecca Holloway, who'd gone missing from Second Beach in 2011. She'd been 29, a marine biologist from Seattle who'd come to study tide pool ecosystems. She'd been camping alone. Her tent was found abandoned, her research equipment scattered on the beach. Presumed drowning. No body recovered. Until now. Detective Morrison organized a massive search of the forest behind Second Beach, using ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs. Over 3 days, they found 6 more burial sites. 6 sets of remains, all buried in shallow graves, all showing signs of trauma consistent with drowning. But they hadn't drowned in the ocean. They'd been drowned deliberately, held underwater until they died, and then buried in the forest. The media got wind of the story, and suddenly Second Beach was crawling with reporters and cameras. We had to close off the entire section of coastline, turning away tourists and locals alike. The investigation became the biggest thing to hit Olympic National Park in decades. But here's what we still didn't know. Who was doing this? And where were they now? The break came on the 4th day. A local fisherman named Raymond Garrett came forward with information. He'd been fishing near Second Beach on the night Ivy Monroe disappeared, anchored offshore in his boat. He hadn't said anything before because he'd been fishing in a restricted area and didn't want to get in trouble. But once he heard about the investigation, his conscience got the better of him. "I saw someone on the beach that night," Raymond told Detective Morrison and me as we sat in an interview room at the ranger station. "Around 4 in the morning, I was getting ready to pull anchor and head back when I saw a light on the shore. Thought it was another fisherman at first, but then I looked through my binoculars and saw it was someone walking along the waterline with a flashlight." "Can you describe them?" Morrison asked. "Not really, too dark, and they were too far away, but I watched them for a few minutes and they were moving deliberately, like they were searching for something. They'd shine the light on the water, then walk a few yards, then stop and look again." "Did you see anyone else, a woman maybe, in the water or on the beach?" Raymond hesitated. "I saw something in the water. Thought it was a seal at first, but it was too big. And it wasn't moving like a seal, it was just floating. But then the person with the flashlight got close to it and they waded into the water. I couldn't see what happened next because they turned the light off. But I heard splashing, like someone was struggling. It lasted maybe 30 seconds, and then everything went quiet." Morrison and I exchanged glances. "What did you do then?" she asked. "I left," Raymond said, his voice heavy with guilt. "I knew something wasn't right, but I was scared. I'd been fishing illegally and I didn't want to get involved, so I started my engine and got out of there. But I've been thinking about it ever since, wondering if I could have stopped something, if I could have helped." "Did you see where the person with the flashlight went after that?" I asked. "Back into the tree line. They just walked off the beach and disappeared into the forest." Morrison immediately organized a search of the forest for any signs of a permanent camp or shelter. If someone was living out here, operating for years, They had to have a base somewhere. And we found it. About 2 miles inland from Second Beach, hidden in a dense thicket of trees, was a small cabin. It was primitive, maybe 10 feet by 10 feet, with no electricity or running water. But someone was living there. There was a sleeping bag, supplies, equipment, and on the walls were photos. Dozens of them, photos of people. Solo hikers, campers, surfers. Some I recognized from the missing persons reports. Others I didn't. All of them were candid shots, taken without their knowledge from a distance. Surveillance photos. And there, in the middle of the wall, was a photo of Ivy Monroe, taken the day she arrived at Second Beach, setting up her tent. We'd found the hunting ground of a serial killer. The cabin was processed as a crime scene, and evidence teams spent days going through everything. They found journals detailing the stalking and killing of at least 11 people, including Ivy Monroe. They found trophies, jewelry, driver's licenses, personal items taken from victims, and they found plans for future targets, people who were currently camping in the park, people who didn't know they were being watched. But they didn't find the killer. Whoever had been living in that cabin was gone, vanished as completely as their victims. We issued alerts, put out descriptions based on Raymond's testimony and evidence from the cabin. The FBI launched a manhunt that spread across 3 states. They caught him 2 weeks later in Oregon, trying to enter another national park. His name was Kenneth Bryce, 53, a former park ranger who'd been fired 15 years ago for inappropriate behavior toward visitors. He'd been living off the grid ever since, haunting the coastline, targeting the vulnerable and isolated. He confessed to everything: the drownings, the burials, the years of careful planning and execution. He showed no remorse. When asked why he did it, he simply said, "The ocean takes people all the time. I was just helping it along." It's been 3 months since we closed the case. Kenneth Bryce is awaiting trial, and the families of his victims finally have answers, finally have remains to bury. The old campsite we found, the one with the carved message, we determined it belonged to Rebecca Holloway. She'd managed to escape Bryce once, had lived in that camp for days, leaving markers to warn others. But he'd found her again, and she'd become another victim. Second Beach is open again, but it's different now. There's a memorial where Ivy Monroe's tent once stood, flowers and photos left by people who never knew her but were touched by her story. The forbidden zones are more strictly enforced, and we've increased ranger presence on the coastline. I still patrol this stretch every day. And every time I walk that beach, I think about the 15 people who came here seeking solitude, adventure, or peace, who found death instead. I think about how easily it could have continued. How many more might have disappeared if that fisherman hadn't come forward, if we hadn't found that old campsite with its desperate warning. The ocean is still dangerous. The rocks are still slippery. The currents still deadly. The fog still thick. But now we know that the greatest danger wasn't the ocean at all. It was the monster hiding in the forest, patient and calculating, using the ocean's reputation to mask his crimes. I found Ivy Monroe's journal entry again recently, the one where she wrote, "Maybe the ocean will tell me." And in a way, it did. The ocean led us to the truth, even if the truth was darker than any of us could have imagined. The Pacific doesn't forgive mistakes. That's still true. But now I know that sometimes the ocean isn't the thing you need to fear. Sometimes the real danger is the one watching from the shadows, waiting for you to let your guard down. Sometimes the monster isn't in the water at all.